Hi everybody. Tonight we begin a story unlike any other. In the soft hush of a world long gone, cloaked in candlelight and whispered rumors, there lived kings, powerful, unpredictable, and sometimes profoundly perverse. This isn't just a tale of war and crowns, but of passions unchecked, desires twisted by power, and the strange, dark hearts of men who ruled with velvet gloves concealing iron fists. Over the next few hours, we will journey slowly, dreamily, through 24 chapters that each reveal a new layer of history's strangest monarchs. Those whose names were whispered in bedchambers more often than war rooms, whose scandals ignited fires in gossip-hungry courts, and whose legacy left shadows longer than any battlefield. So find your quiet place, lay your head back, and let your thoughts drift with mine. We'll start with one of the most unforgettable names in medieval debauchery, King Charles II of Navarre. It was the spring of 1349, and the Kingdom of Navarre, nestled precariously between France and Spain, was still trying to breathe beneath the suffocating grip of the Black Death. The countryside was littered with both bodies and broken faith, and in the grand halls of the Palace of Elite, a boy king was beginning to stretch his influence. His name was Charles, soon to be known to history as Charles the Bad. But bad hardly captured the full measure of his nature. Charles was not yet 20 when he began to display traits that made even seasoned courtiers flinch. His eyes, pale and oddly luminous, held the kind of eerie calm that makes men wonder if they are speaking to a human or something darker. He was clever, too clever, some said, and had inherited from his mother a keen understanding of courtly manipulation, and from his father an explosive temper that flared unpredictably. He was married to Joan of France, the daughter of King John II of France, a union that should have been a diplomatic triumph. But to Charles, women, whether queens or milkmaids, were prizes to be collected, bent, and broken if necessary. Servants whispered of midnight screams and bruises hidden beneath silks. It was said he kept a ledger, an actual bound volume of every woman he had lain with, not for pride, but for power. Each name was followed by a mark indicating whether she had been willing, bribed, blackmailed, or taken by force. He relished breaking convent vows more than peace treaties. His seductions of noble women were rarely secret. He made a show of it, challenging husbands to duels or hosting them at feasts where their wives sat beside him, flushed and fearful. But it was not mere lust that earned Charles his infamous title. It was his love of deception, cruelty, and above all, vengeance. In 1354, he orchestrated the assassination of Charles de la Cerda, the Constable of France, whom he suspected of threatening his influence at court. When questioned, Charles gave a thin smile and shrugged. Kings must clean their palaces, mustn't they? He spoke as if murder were merely a kind of housekeeping. From that moment, a pattern emerged. His pleasures darkened in tandem with his politics. Enemies were not just exiled, they were humiliated. Their wives defiled, their sons conscripted and sent to the most dangerous borders, their lands salted so nothing could grow. And he was just getting started. In his private apartments, Charles had a fascination with pain. He brought back from Moorish territory strange instruments, chains with hooked teeth, silver rods that could be heated in fire and cooled in wine, ropes designed not to bruise but to leave intricate red tattoos on skin. Several chambermaids disappeared. The official records claimed they had married and moved away, but their families received no letters, no word. One of the few servants brave enough to speak, a stable hand named Armand, described once sneaking into the lower chambers and hearing what he called a woman's crying that didn't stop. No pause, no breath, just weeping like it came from the walls themselves. Armand vanished 2 days later. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of these rumors, Charles was beloved by many of his nobles. He understood the art of gifting. He bestowed rich estates to his favorites, held extravagant balls with exotic dancers from the East, and staged jousts where the winners received both gold and women. He turned sin into ceremony. By 1360, his reputation had reached the ears of commoners far beyond his borders. Minstrels sang of the Wolf of Navarre, with verses that were banned in churches but hummed by blacksmiths and barmaids. One popular ballad described how Charles, bored of the usual debauchery, had seduced the daughters of 3 rival barons on the same night in the same bed beneath the tapestry of the Last Supper. Another tale claimed that Charles once disguised himself as a priest to perform confessions, only to use the secrets he heard for blackmail. Whether these were true or merely legends, no one could say, but the fear they sowed was real. And perhaps what made Charles truly dangerous was this: he never considered himself evil. In fact, he believed deeply that he was chosen by God, chosen to punish the hypocrites, to tear down the prideful, to expose weakness and virtue and celebrate the hidden truth that every man is driven not by righteousness but desire. So when Charles looked into his own soul and saw a mirror full of lust and shadows, he didn't flinch. He saw instead a king made perfect. Navarre suffered under him, yes, but it also expanded. Trade increased. Taxes were collected with ruthless efficiency. The army was modernized. Even his enemies admitted that Charles was effective. But at what cost? He died in 1387, wrapped in linen soaked in brandy as part of a supposed medical treatment. A servant, fumbling with a candle, ignited the wrappings. Charles burned alive, slowly, screaming, and the court, paralyzed with horror, watched. The same nobles who had once bowed to him now wept or turned their eyes away. Not one dared help. His final words were said to be, "I am still your king." But the flames, it seemed, thought otherwise. And that, dear listener, is only the beginning. Shall we continue deeper into the shadows of another castle where another king waits to share his secrets with us? The year was 1490, and the scent of rosewater clung to the thick velvet curtains of the royal palace in Naples. A warm dusk bathed the city in gold, while merchants and poets filled the streets. But beyond the painted walls, behind the marble doors and mosaic corridors of the Aragonese court, there lived a man whose appetites were known far beyond the Mediterranean shores. Alfonso II of Naples, the bastard-born son of Ferdinand I, had inherited a crown not through divine grace but through cunning, conquest, and a strange kind of magnetic cruelty. Unlike Charles of Navarre, whose evil wore the armor of war, Alfonso cloaked his depravity in art, music, and religion. He was a lover of sculptures, a patron of frescoes, and a connoisseur of flesh. When one entered Alfonso's chambers, the eye was first drawn to the walls, covered not in tapestries, but in portraits of women, not queens, not duchesses, but servants, courtesans, dancers, and occasionally young boys, painted in poses of exquisite vulnerability, their gazes haunted, their bodies exposed. It was said that Alfonso handpicked these models personally, often inviting them to the palace under the guise of employment or protection. What awaited them, however, was a gilded cage, a prison lined with silk. Those who served him closely referred to a place within the palace called the Chapel of Desire. It was not listed on any architectural plans, and its entrance was concealed behind a wooden panel near the royal library. Inside, the chamber was small and circular, with a domed ceiling painted in heavenly frescoes. Cherubs, angels, and saints all looking down with expressions that hovered between ecstasy and agony. At the center stood a bed shaped like a Roman banquet couch. The mattress was crimson velvet, and beside it, a low table always held a silver bowl filled with sugared almonds and white wine perfumed with saffron. Those who were brought to the chapel never returned unchanged. A Venetian merchant, captured in Alfonso's court records, claimed to have once been invited for a private audience. When he entered the chapel, he was made to watch a performance. Two young boys, dressed in angelic garb, reading verses from the Psalms while kneeling naked. The merchant left the next morning with a satchel of gold and a face that had gone pale forever. Alfonso was known to believe that pain elevated pleasure, and that God's presence could be felt most acutely in the moment of humiliation. This belief became doctrine in his private court. Those who served him intimately were made to learn Latin prayers recited in reverse, whispered as they were tied in silk cords and blindfolded. He had a scribe whose only task was to document these encounters, not for blackmail, but for pleasure. Pages upon pages described every encounter in painstaking detail, often annotated by Alfonso himself in the margins. These records were bound in black leather and hidden in a locked coffer behind the altar of the palace chapel. It was his most sacred treasure. There was one story that floated between servants like candlelight at midnight. It spoke of a girl named Isabetta, only 15, whose family had sent her to the court as a seamstress. Alfonso took an interest in her almost immediately. She was never summoned, only watched. Each day, as she passed the gardens, he observed her from a window behind heavy drapes. When he finally approached her, it was with the soft voice of a confessor. He promised to elevate her status, to give her family land, to protect her from the cruelty of lesser men. He wore no crown in her presence, only a robe of ivory silk. He fed her honeyed figs and spoke of the Virgin Mary's sorrow, likening Isabella to the Madonna herself. She did not resist. But a week later, she vanished. Her room was stripped clean, as though she had never existed. Her name was erased from palace records. Her bed in the servants' wing remained empty until Alfonso's death. In the political realm, Alfonso was ruthless. He crushed rebellions with surgical brutality. He used his network of spies not only to maintain order, but to unearth the secrets of his enemies. One of his favorite tactics was to seduce the wives and daughters of opposing nobles, then send them home with bruised wrists and a gift of pearls. He was married, of course. His queen, Ippolita, was a devout woman who lived more in convents than at court. She was aware of his proclivities, but remained silent, choosing prayer over confrontation. She spent most of her time in a secluded villa overlooking the sea, far from the chapel of desire. Some say Alfonso never loved her. Others say he adored her precisely because she was untouchable, a relic of purity in a kingdom of sin. His court, though dazzling in its splendor, became a theater of quiet terror. Nobles smiled too wide, musicians played too long, poets praised too loudly. All knew that favor could be gained in a single whispered confession, or lost forever in a glance. Alfonso's downfall was as swift as it was poetic. In 1495, as French forces approached Naples under the command of Charles VIII, Alfonso abdicated the throne in fear, not of the enemy's armies, but of divine punishment. He became convinced that he was being haunted by the souls of those he had corrupted. He claimed to see them in mirrors, hear them in the wind. He fled the city and took refuge in a monastery, trading his silks for sackcloth. But even there, his demons followed. The monks reported that he would wake screaming in the night, clawing at his own skin. One night, he ran into the chapel, tore off his robe, and knelt before the crucifix, sobbing uncontrollably. He died shortly after, from what physicians called a nervous fever. His body was buried in the monastery crypt, beneath a slab of unmarked stone, but the chapel of desire remained. When the French entered Naples, they ransacked the palace and uncovered the hidden room. The contents of the coffer were burned in the square, the paintings stripped. But whispers of Alfonso's exploits had already spread across Europe like a blush on a cheek. And in some dark corners, in candlelit rooms where history is passed not through books but breath, he is still remembered. Not as a king, but as a man who turned pleasure into ritual and sin into an art. In the early hours before dawn, when the streets of Prague were still cloaked in dew and silence, the torches within Hradčany Castle never stopped burning. Inside its ancient stone walls, laughter echoed, a slow, indulgent sound, like wine being poured in slow motion. The year was 1611, and upon the Bohemian throne sat a man not often spoken of in official chronicles, but frequently whispered about by maids, guards, and traveling minstrels. Rudolph II, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He was not a conventional ruler. He was not even, by many accounts, sane. But what made Rudolph infamous was not his political failures, nor his reclusive nature. It was the world he built within his walls. A palace of curiosity, mysticism, and depravity, where science and seduction danced in equal measure. From the outside, the imperial court appeared as one of Europe's most enlightened centers. Alchemists from Venice, astronomers from Persia, philosophers from Spain, all found patronage under Rudolph's gilded roof. He sponsored Johannes Kepler, hosted Tycho Brahe, and was rumored to keep correspondence with men who claimed to summon angels from brass mirrors. But beneath this academic facade pulsed a darker obsession. Rudolph believed that truth could only be found in extremes, in the collision between ecstasy and agony, divine and perverse. He sought not only the philosopher's stone, but the secret heart of pleasure itself. His private wing of the castle, forbidden to all but a select few, was known as the Cabinet of Shadows. It was a maze of chambers, some circular like wombs, others narrow as coffins. Each room had a purpose, a ritual, and a guest book of those who had entered, and either begged to return or prayed never to again. One such chamber was lined entirely in mirrors, but not the polished, forgiving kind. These were warped, designed to twist reflections into grotesque parodies of self. Rudolph believed that true desire lay in confronting the monstrous within. He often watched guests enter this room nude, asking them to speak aloud their darkest wishes as their reflections sneered back at them. Those who faltered were dismissed. Those who continued, marked. There was, too, the Crimson Library, so named for its red-dyed floor, which some said was not paint but dried blood sealed in wax. The books within were bound in human skin, parchments that described forbidden rites, poems written by mad monks, anatomical sketches that veered into the sacrilegious. Rudolph would spend hours there, cross-legged, naked, smoking resin from an ivory pipe, reading aloud to a naked court musician who played eerie notes on a viola da gamba. He was known to keep a harem, not of courtesans, but of androgynous scholars and actors. They wore masks of cherubs and spoke only in riddles. At mealtimes, they fed him pomegranate seeds from their mouths, passing them lip to lip like communion. There is a story about a boy named Leon, a Polish orphan taken into the court after performing a dance before the emperor at a feast. He was beautiful in the way statues are, symmetrical, cold, untouchable. Rudolph adored him. For months, Leon was lavished with silks, gold-threaded robes, even a tiny crown made of pearls. But the boy was also clever. Too clever. He began to mock the emperor's rituals in secret, repeating the incantations with a curled lip, mimicking the procession of masked lovers in front of drunken courtiers. Word reached Rudolph. What happened next was never written, but only passed between generations of court staff. Leon disappeared. Some claimed he was buried beneath the alchemical labs. Others said he still wandered the mirrored halls, made mute by a silver spike driven through his tongue. But most agreed on one thing. After Leon vanished, Rudolph became worse. He stopped attending council meetings altogether. He wandered the halls in slippers, muttering about spirits. He ordered that a room be kept eternally cold, with snow transported daily from the mountains, simply so he could lie naked in it and feel winter on his bones. He surrounded himself with relics of saints, fingers in glass vials, teeth set in gold rings, and kissed them before bed. But each morning, he returned to the cabinet, seeking not salvation, but sensation. One of his most trusted advisors, a man named Lazarus, once wrote in a secret letter, "The emperor does not wish to rule men. He wishes to own their dreams, their fears, and their lusts." Eventually, his mental decline became too much to ignore. In 1611, his own brother Matthias forced him to abdicate. Rudolph locked himself in his palace for the final months, speaking to wax dolls he believed were spirits. He died in his bed, surrounded by empty perfume bottles and a final sketch of a winged creature with human lips and goat eyes. At his funeral, priests refused to enter the cabinet of shadows. It was sealed with holy wax and bricked over. But years later, when the Swedes sacked Prague in the 30 Years' War, they pried it open. What they found inside was not recorded, but the soldiers burned every item they found and threw the ashes into the Vltava River. And yet, even now, the river is said to carry a scent in summer, a blend of myrrh, iron, and roses. The scent that once clung to an emperor who believed pleasure was the only truth worth ruling for. In the shadowed corners of Burgundy's vineyards, where the mists hang low and the crows circle fields even in midsummer, the name of Philip the Good is still spoken with a strange blend of pride and unease. To the world, he was a statesman, artful, strategic, generous to the arts. But beneath his polished court and finely penned treaties, there existed a darker realm of indulgence. Philip of Burgundy, ruling in the 15th century, understood the mechanics of seduction the way generals understand siege warfare. It required patience, resources, and overwhelming force. His public persona was one of composure. His eyes, a shade of grayish blue, never betrayed his intentions. His smile, always just wide enough, disarmed even the most suspicious noble. He married 3 times, and each union strengthened his grip on the Low Countries. Yet Philip's true passion was never politics. It was the cultivation of pleasure. Pleasure raised not to the level of vice, but ceremony. He began what he called La Confrérie des Plaisirs, the Brotherhood of Pleasures. Ostensibly a chivalric society of noblemen dedicated to refinement and courtly life, it was, in truth, a secret guild of libertines. Its membership included dukes, barons, and even bishops, men who wore crosses in the day and masks at night. Their gatherings were always held on the new moon, in secluded estates or underground halls lit only by beeswax candles. Each event had a theme: Eros and silence, the seven sins, the fall of Eve, and costumes, always costumes designed by Philip himself, drawing inspiration from Greek tragedy, pagan ritual, and nightmares. Women and sometimes boys were brought in, never by force, but through promise, flattery, or subtle coercion. They were draped in translucent silks and adorned with golden chains and taught to move to the sound of a single lute. No drums, no clapping, just slow, hypnotic melodies that curled around the senses like smoke. A favored ritual began with the anointing of flesh. Members of the Brotherhood would take turns applying warmed oils to one another's bodies, whispering lines from Ovid and the Song of Songs in Latin. Philip believed that the ancient tongue heightened arousal and lowered shame. But it was not merely debauchery. Philip brought to these gatherings a philosopher's gaze. He would observe the events with a wine goblet in hand, dictating impressions to a scribe, another Brotherhood member, who recorded everything in code. These chronicles were bound in black calfskin and stored in an iron chest beneath the ducal palace in Dijon. The scribes wrote of masks shaped like animal heads, of blindfolded dancers spinning in circles, while incantations echoed through stone arches. They wrote of Philip's rule: no punishment, only participation. But those who refused to indulge were never invited again, and in court, such exclusion often meant ruin. One notable participant was a cardinal from Avignon, a man known for his piety in daylight. At night, he wore robes of crimson lace and recited psalms backward as part of an initiation. Another was a widow duchess who claimed to have seen angels in the throes of passion and became obsessed with recreating the vision. Philip, in his deepest moments, spoke of ecstasy as a form of spiritual transcendence. He argued that to fully grasp God, one must first surrender every earthly inhibition. To him, physical acts were steps in a divine ladder, each moan a hymn, each shiver a kind of absolution. But there was one night that changed everything. In the spring of 1440, the Brotherhood gathered in an abandoned monastery outside Ghent. The theme was judgment and temptation. Philip wore a robe fashioned from feathers and gold thread, declaring himself the Archangel of Flesh. The wine was mixed with poppy syrup. The air was thick with musk and incense. During the height of the gathering, a young noble named Lull, barely 20, stood up and accused Philip of heresy. "You seek God not in heaven, but in heat," he shouted. The music stopped. All eyes turned to the Duke. Philip's expression didn't change. He simply beckoned Raoul forward and asked him to dance. The boy hesitated, then obeyed. No one spoke of what followed in detail. But Raoul was never seen at court again. Rumors said he had been locked in a tower, where each night a different member of the Brotherhood visited him, whispering prayers and promises. By autumn, Raoul was dead. Officially, it was illness. But servants spoke of fingernails torn away and lips bitten until blood coated his chin. After that, the Brotherhood became more secretive. The rituals grew darker, less theatrical, and more primal. The themes turned toward death and rebirth, submission and silence. Philip, aging but still sharp, grew increasingly obsessed with control. He designed a chamber beneath the Dijon palace, lined with obsidian tiles and a single iron bed. Only select guests were brought there, always blindfolded, always disoriented. He called it the Chamber of Returning, where one was said to confront their past sins in flesh and shadow. He claimed that to enter and return alive was to be reborn. Philip died in 1467 at the age of 71. Officially, it was from fever. But his physician wrote a private letter to a colleague stating that Philip's heart had burst, as if from a surging tide held too long within narrow banks. At his funeral, the Brotherhood did not attend. His body lay in state beneath a tapestry of the Last Judgment, lips curled in what some said was a smile. Others said it was a grimace. After his death, his personal chambers were sealed, his journals hidden, and the Brotherhood dissolved. But pieces remain. A mask here, a ritual phrase there. And sometimes at midnight, beneath the vaulted ceilings of Dijon's ancient halls, echoes still drift. A low moan, a whispered verse, the rustle of silk. All relics of a man who believed that desire, when sanctified by ceremony, could make even sin beautiful. The salt, sweet wind that danced across the hills of Naples carried with it stories. Stories of ships, of saints, of sunbathed villas perched high above the sea. But in the spring of 1768, the people began whispering a new story, a strange, intoxicating tale that clung to alleyways and echoed in the halls of palace kitchens. It was the tale of a young king, barely a man, who would soon become one of the strangest monarchs Europe had ever seen. Ferdinand I of the Two Sicilies, born of Bourbon blood and Spanish steel, took the throne with the uncertainty of a boy playing dress-up. His mind, by all accounts, was a curious thing, neither slow nor clever, but ruled entirely by appetite. Not for conquest, not for art, but for pleasure in its crudest, purest form. He hated courtiers, hated conversations, hated books, but he adored animals, pranks, hunting, food, and women. Most of all, women. From his earliest days on the throne, Ferdinand surrounded himself with what he called I miei amici di sotto, my friends below. They were not nobles. They were fishermen, cooks, stable boys, shepherds. He felt more at ease with their rough laughter, their earthy jokes. He would often sneak from royal meetings to join them in the kitchens, where he would eat with his hands and slap backs until his palms were red. But his desires did not stop with their friendship. Ferdinand transformed the royal palace into a strange kind of private theater. He built hidden corridors, peepholes carved discreetly into frescoed walls, and balconies from which he could watch both courtly dances and more private displays. He employed dancers from Naples' seedier theaters, commissioning performances that began with operatic arias and ended with moans that rivaled them in volume. His favorite dancer, a woman named Lucia, was said to have worn only pearls during her nightly routines. But perhaps the most unsettling part of Ferdinand's world was his obsession with humiliation, not his own, but that of others. He would throw lavish banquets, inviting nobles, merchants, and foreign ambassadors. But the entertainment was never what the guests expected. One dinner featured a feast of beasts, in which trained animals, monkeys, pigs, even a leopard, were dressed in courtly garments and seated at the table alongside guests. The animals were fed better than the people. The king laughed until tears rolled down his face, watching as a monkey in a bishop's robe threw bread at a startled diplomat. Another evening, he invited several high-ranking clergymen to a solemn meal, only for the ceiling to release hundreds of frogs into the room. The guests shrieked, dishes overturned, candles sputtered, and Ferdinand clapped like a delighted child. But his cruelty was never simply for spectacle. It fed something deeper in him, something darker. He kept a private hall within the Capodimonte Palace, a space never listed on any plans. Inside, the floor was made of padded leather, the walls lined with mirrors and paintings of hunting scenes. Here, women were brought not as guests, but as performances. Servants were instructed to remain silent, their eyes downcast. The women were often masked, their identities unknown even to each other. Ferdinand would lie on a raised dais, watching. Sometimes, he would toss coins onto the floor, barking like a dog, and whoever fetched the coin on all fours was granted a personal audience with him afterward. His guards were instructed not to intervene, no matter what they heard, and what they heard often made even the most hardened soldier shift uncomfortably at his post. Though married to Maria Carolina of Austria, a strong and intelligent woman, Ferdinand treated her like an inconvenient formality. She had come from the Habsburg court, raised among books and political philosophy, and tried briefly to steer her husband toward duty, but she quickly realized what she was up against. So she ruled from the shadows, crafting alliances and policy, while Ferdinand chased pheasants in the countryside or staged erotic puppet shows in his private salons. Yes, puppet shows. He commissioned marionettes carved with the likenesses of real nobles. The scripts were obscene parodies of court life, often featuring exaggerated betrayals, affairs, and lewd jokes. He would sit alone or with his fishermen friends, roaring with laughter as a puppet version of a rival baron was chased around a stage by a wooden courtesan with comically oversized breasts. To those outside the court, Ferdinand was a buffoon, a grotesque joke in royal garb, but those within the palace knew better. He was a man whose power had never been questioned, whose whims could become law with a nod, and who enjoyed watching people squirm more than he enjoyed ruling them. In time, his behaviors took on a ritualistic tone. He began to believe that embarrassment broke down a person's outer shell, that once humiliated, a subject became real. He staged mock trials where nobles were accused of absurd crimes, wearing a face too smug, offending the pigeons, making soup that lacked character. The punishments were equally absurd, dancing naked in the garden at midnight, pretending to be a chicken during dinner, or being carried through the streets in a wheelbarrow. And yet few dared to refuse. For all his foolishness, Ferdinand had the power to destroy. There was a merchant named Donato, wealthy and proud, who refused to laugh during one of the puppet shows. The next morning, his shop was burned, his sons conscripted into the army, and his wife summoned to the palace for a private audience. Donato's family left Naples within the week. Toward the end of his life, Ferdinand grew paranoid. He began to fear his own reflection, convinced that mirrors could betray his secrets. Many were shattered. Those that remained were covered in cloth. He spoke of devils in the palace walls, spirits that had grown fat from years of indulgence. He took to sleeping in a different room each night, guarded by fishermen armed with crude knives and crosses made of driftwood. And when revolution reached the kingdom in whispers and fire, Ferdinand fled, not to lead his people, but to hide. He would later return briefly, restored by foreign allies, but his shadow never regained its shape. He was no longer a king of pleasure, merely a madman with memories. And yet, even as Naples rebuilt, those who had served in his court remembered, not the laws, not the battles, but the nights of masks and moans, the laughter of beasts, and the glint of a coin tossed into the darkness. In the cold corridors of St. James's Palace, behind the crimson velvet and ticking clocks of the British monarchy, there once reigned a prince whose vices outshone even his titles. George IV, first as Prince of Wales, later as regent, and finally as king, was the embodiment of indulgence gilded in royal finery. Born in 1762, George was handsome in his youth. He had the kind of beauty that artists adored. Delicate features, full lips, a sensual curve to his eyes that gave even his portraits a flirtatious glow. But beauty, in his case, was a gateway, a trapdoor into a life fueled by hunger, for adoration, for sensation, and most of all, for the forbidden. From the moment he reached adolescence, George detested constraint. He loathed discipline, scorned virtue, and treated responsibility as an insult to his nature. What he wanted, he consumed, be it brandy, lace, lovers, or lies. He surrounded himself with actors, courtesans, and poets who praised him with rehearsed spontaneity. He collected luxuries like a dragon hoards gold. His residences, Carlton House, Brighton Pavilion, became palaces not of governance but of gratification. The Brighton Pavilion, in particular, was a mirror of George's mind, fantastical, excessive, surreal. A strange blend of Chinese, Indian, and Gothic styles, it pulsed with sensuality. There were rooms for music, rooms for feasting, rooms for lounging, and rooms that no one dared name aloud. One such chamber, known only to his closest companions, was hidden behind a mural of peacocks. The entrance was a concealed panel that opened with a particular twist of a jade vase. Inside, the walls were draped with silks imported from Bengal, the air thick with sandalwood and orange blossom. At its center was a bed unlike any other, a vast circular platform suspended slightly off the ground by golden chains. Above it, an ornate dome glittered with painted scenes from classical mythology, Leda and the Swan, Pan and Syrinx, Dionysian revels frozen in mid-ecstasy. This was George's sanctuary. Here he received not only mistresses, but lovers of every persuasion. George's appetites were fluid, and he made no effort to disguise them in private. Young officers, foreign emissaries, actors disguised as noblemen, all passed through the silken veil of his hidden chamber. His favorite for a time was a French violinist named Jacques, whose fingers, they said, played just as eloquently on strings as on skin. George kept him clothed in blue velvet and pearls, and for nearly a year, Jacques lived within the palace walls, sharing not only the king's bed but his secrets. But when Jacques grew too bold, mocking the king's waistline and speaking carelessly to the press, he vanished. Some say he was paid off, others that he fled to Paris in fear. But those who worked in the pavilion claimed to have heard music, faint and sorrowful, drifting from the sealed garden on rainy nights. George's cruelty was not physical, but psychological. He wielded shame like a dagger, striking those who disappointed him with cutting words and social ruin. He once summoned a noblewoman, Lady Anne Fitzroy, famed for both her wit and her virginity, to a private masquerade. When she refused his advances, he had a caricature drawn of her, exaggerated and obscene, and distributed it in coded pamphlets among the aristocracy. Her reputation never recovered, and yet George was worshipped by many. He was the patron of style, the trendsetter of a decadent age. He transformed manners, architecture, and fashion. He could charm a room into silence, then into laughter, then into stunned fascination. His excesses were legendary. He bathed in wine-scented water, wore coats stitched with gold thread, and demanded that his desserts be molded into the shapes of Greek gods. His breakfasts consisted of pheasant, lobster, spiced chocolate, and champagne. His debts were mountainous, over £500,000 by the time he was 30, but Parliament, desperate to keep him happy and distracted, paid them quietly. Still, beneath all the luxury was a bottomless pit. George often spoke of emptiness. In letters to his few confidants, he confessed to nightmares of drowning in silk, of being smothered by lovers with painted smiles and no eyes. In the later years of his life, his once beautiful body grew grotesque. He became massively overweight, plagued by gout and addiction. Servants were required to carry him from bed to chair. He drank laudanum for pain and brandy for boredom, and yet the hidden room remained. Even as his health failed, George demanded it be maintained exactly. The silks were dusted weekly. The bed was kept fresh. The lamps were lit each evening. One servant, an elderly man named Thomas, who had been with George for decades, once confided to a priest that the king spent his final nights alone in that room, staring at the painted dome, whispering apologies in languages no one recognized. He died in 1830, his heart bloated and weary. At the time of his death, many celebrated. Politicians breathed easier. The press mocked him. But in the private journals of his tailor, his chef, his chamberlain, those who had known the man, not the monarch, a different tone emerged. They described a soul both magnificent and monstrous, a man who built cathedrals of pleasure to escape the knowledge that he was, in the end, unloved. And long after his funeral, the pavilion remained. Tourists came to admire its domes and chandeliers, but none were ever shown the peacock mural. That panel, they say, was sealed, and behind it the room still waits, suspended in time, scented faintly of sandalwood and longing. The Carpathian dusks settled thick over the spires of Sibiu, and the wolves began their chorus from the forest's edge. In the halls of Corvin Castle, stone bastion of shadow and grandeur, there once lived a man whose passions would come to haunt not just his own bloodline, but the fabric of myth itself. John Hunyadi was the noble patriarch, the great defender of Christendom. But this tale does not belong to him. It belongs to his son, Matthias Corvinus, King of Hungary, Lord of Croatia, and a ruler whose brilliance in diplomacy was rivaled only by the strange rituals that unfolded behind his sealed doors. Crowned in 1458, Matthias was young, intelligent, and dangerously beautiful. His eyes were like polished obsidian, and his smile had the softness of fresh snowfall. But his desires ran deeper than mere indulgence. He was a collector, not of art, though he did gather manuscripts and illuminated tomes, nor of treasures, though his halls gleamed with gold. Matthias collected people, and not just people, obedience, suffering, transformation. He was enthralled by the idea that love, loyalty, and pleasure could be harvested through meticulous design. His court became a theater, and his subjects, unwitting or not, became his actors. The first signs of this came quietly. A stable boy named Emmerich was promoted to royal companion without explanation. He had no education, no family of influence. Yet, within days, he wore silks, dined beside nobles, and slept in rooms adjoining the king's. The courtiers whispered, but none dared challenge Matthias. He spoke with such calm authority, with such poetic certainty, that even dissent felt like betrayal. Emmerich, once shy and simple, changed. His eyes grew hollow, his speech stilted. He was seen wandering the castle gardens at night, reciting Latin verses to no one. And then, one day, he was gone, officially reassigned to a distant garrison. But the guards at that garrison swore he never arrived. It was around this time that Matthias commissioned the construction of a peculiar annex beneath Corvin Castle. It was accessed through a narrow spiral staircase concealed behind a portrait of Saint Sebastian. The rooms below were unlike any in Europe. They were not dungeons. There were no chains, no screams. Instead, there were silk-covered couches, candlelit alcoves, and a great circular chamber with a floor of mosaic glass depicting scenes from Ovid's Metamorphoses. At the center of this chamber stood a pedestal. On it, a single chair carved from white marble, shaped like an open hand. This was the sanctum. Here, Matthias would invite select guests, diplomats, artists, even rival nobles. But entry required a ritual, the removal of all garments, the acceptance of a whispered vow, and the surrender of names. Once within, no one was called by title or heritage. Each participant was given a mask and a symbol. They were then led into a performance orchestrated by the king himself, a dance of sensuality, power, and occasionally pain. Matthias believed that only when identity was stripped away could one encounter true intimacy. He spoke often of the sacred mirror, a metaphor for seeing oneself not as the world does, but as desire reveals. There were those who returned from these nights changed, shaken, radiant, broken, enlightened. Some left the court entirely, retreating into monasteries or madness. Others rose in power, bound to the king not by politics, but by memory. One noblewoman, Countess Ilona, was said to have entered the sanctum every week for a year. She abandoned her family, her estates, even her own name. She signed all documents with a symbol, a coiled serpent, and wore only white. No one ever asked her why. And then there was the boy known only as Arius. He appeared at court suddenly, a foreigner with hair like river gold and skin like ivory. Matthias referred to him as my shadow, and for years Arius was never more than a few steps from the king. He sat at his feet during councils, lay beside him during feasts, and at the sanctum was said to lead many of the rituals himself. But one winter, Arius vanished. The official statement was that he drowned while bathing, but no body was ever recovered. And that same week, a fresco appeared in the sanctum's central chamber, newly painted, unsigned. It depicted a winged boy falling from the sky, his face tilted upward, his arms outstretched. Matthias would sit for hours before it, silent. As his reign progressed, the king became increasingly withdrawn. His policies remained brilliant. He negotiated treaties, reformed taxation, funded libraries. But his nights were consumed by something else. Witnesses claimed to hear music at impossible hours, slow, haunting melodies played on viols and lutes drifting from beneath the castle. There were rumors of foreign guests who arrived cloaked and silent, staying for days, then leaving with pale faces and trembling hands. And always the king smiled, gently, as if he alone knew the language of their suffering. When he died in 1490, suddenly, with no heir, the court descended into chaos. Nobles fought for influence. Foreign powers circled like vultures, but the castle remained untouched, its secrets guarded by silence. Years later, when Habsburg rulers finally claimed the territory, they attempted to renovate Corbin Castle. Workers stumbled upon the hidden passage behind St. Sebastian's portrait. They descended the spiral stairs, expecting forgotten storerooms. What they found was the sanctum, untouched, dustless, as if waiting. The fresco still shone, the marble hands still gleamed, and the candles, though long extinguished, held the faintest scent of myrrh and rose. The new rulers ordered it sealed. But even now, when snow falls thick over Transylvania and the wind turns cold enough to silence wolves, locals say that sometimes you can hear music rising from the earth, a slow, aching melody. The final echo of a king who believed that love was not something you gave, but something you shaped with blood, beauty, and the deepest part of the soul. The city of Paris in the twilight of the 14th century was a strange mixture of opulence and rot. Gold glimmered in the chapels of Notre Dame, while sewage ran thick in the alleys nearby. It was a time of saints and sorcerers, of illuminated manuscripts and public executions. And in the heart of this contradiction reigned a king who defied reason itself. Charles VI of France, later called Charles the Mad, was crowned at the tender age of 11. His early reign was guided by wise regents, and for a time the young monarch was everything his lineage demanded. Handsome, devout, regal. But something shifted within him, slowly at first, like a creeping shadow across a cathedral floor. By the time he reached his early 20s, Charles had developed a peculiar fear, the fear of touch. Not of violence or infection, but of something stranger, something deeper. He began to flinch at the softest brush of a hand. Servants were instructed never to approach him unless summoned. He became obsessed with the notion that he was made of glass. This was no poetic metaphor. Charles truly believed that his body, bones and all, had transformed into a delicate crystal. He wore padded garments to protect himself from imagined fractures. He forbade abrupt movement around him and screamed if anyone moved too quickly in his presence. But within this fragile shell burned a furnace of unspoken desires. His paranoia and delusions did not lessen his hunger for power, for submission, for ritual. Instead, they twisted it. One of his most trusted physicians, Master Guillaume, noted in a private letter that the king does not crave women as a man craves wine, but as a priest craves the unspeakable. Charles established a hidden enclave within the Louvre, then a fortress rather than a museum. It was built with thick stone walls, soundproofed with woolen panels, and lit only by narrow arrow-slit windows that let in thin blades of light. This enclave was known only as La Chaleur. At first glance, it was merely a series of private rooms, sleeping chambers, a bathing hall, a confessional. But as one walked deeper, the architecture became stranger. Hallways curved without purpose. Doorways led to alcoves filled with mirrors. The final room, known as the Salle d'Ombre, was circular, lined with cages, not of iron, but of carved wood, painted with gold leaf and tiny fleur-de-lis. Here, Charles enacted his fantasies. He invited monks who had been defrocked for heresy, women who spoke in tongues, actors trained to weep on command. He required them to wear costumes, robes of saints, wings of angels, masks of beasts. Each participant was given a role to play, a script to memorize, a sin to perform. The king sat behind a translucent screen, veiled in black, observing. Sometimes he whispered instructions. Other times he remained silent for hours, the only sound the rasp of his breath and the occasional chime of bells tied to the dancer's ankles. There were nights when Charles would emerge from the shadows, clothed in nothing but a crown of thorns, insisting he was no longer king but a penitent soul sent to test the court's virtue. He would kneel before servants, beg them to strike him, and scream with pleasure when they obeyed. But perhaps the most disturbing rituals were those he called les miroirs de sang, the mirrors of blood. In these ceremonies, Charles required a sacrifice, not of life, but of truth. Each participant had to speak aloud their darkest desire, their most shameful memory, while cutting a shallow wound across their palm and pressing it against a mirror. The mirrors, specially prepared by alchemists, were covered in a thin film of mercury and blessed by mad priests. When the blood touched their surface, Charles believed the reflection changed, revealing not the face of the speaker, but the face of their soul. He would study these mirrors for hours afterward, cataloging what he saw in a journal bound in pale leather. There was no intimacy in his touch, only inspection. One chambermaid, a girl of just 16 named Blanche, was brought into La Chaleur after Charles reportedly saw her crying in the palace garden. He demanded she be brought to him immediately. She was dressed in linen and crowned with ivy, made to sit upon a carved chair in the center of the Salle des Ombres. He did not touch her. Instead, he asked her to sing a lullaby, one from her childhood. And as she sang, he slowly circled her, tearing strips of silk from his own robe and tying them around her wrists and ankles, never binding her, only adorning. When the song ended, he placed a single feather at her feet and whispered, "Your voice is the thread that binds me to the earth." She was dismissed. The next day, she left the palace and never returned. Years later, she was found in a convent near Rouen, deaf and mute, her hands permanently clenched into fists. Charles's madness worsened. He would forget who he was, forget his wife, forget his kingdom. He would wander the palace at night, speaking to statues, accusing walls of treason. And yet, the rituals continued. Even in his most lucid moments, he insisted that La Chaleur be maintained, cleaned, lit. He feared what would happen if it was abandoned. He claimed that within its walls lived the truth of France, and that without it, the crown would crumble. After his death in 1422, La Chaleur was sealed by order of his successor. The doors were barred, the mirrors shattered, the journals burned. But some say the scent of lavender and iron still lingers in the stones of the Louvre's older wings, that the shadows there move a little too deliberately, that if one walks alone at dusk, one might hear a lullaby, faint and trembling, carried on air that smells of fear. And behind the veil of legend and history lies a man who believed he was made of glass, so fragile, so clear, yet shattered not from within, but from what he saw reflected in others. The salt-stung winds of the Atlantic rolled endlessly over the moors of northern Portugal, flattening tall grasses and whispering secrets into the stonework of ancient monasteries. There, in the darkened throne rooms of the House of Aviz, lived a king whose name would be carved into history not only for conquest or bloodline, but for a private life steeped in shadows, obsession, and a hunger that bent even piety to its knees. King João II of Portugal, known to history as the Perfect Prince, ruled in the latter half of the 15th century, a time of maritime ambition and religious zeal. His image, shaped by chroniclers and court painters, was that of a cold and calculating monarch. He was clever, ruthless, a master of espionage, political manipulation, and control. But those who served him closely whispered that his need to dominate did not end with politics. It extended to flesh. Unlike kings who reveled in grand feasts or theatrical pleasures, João's indulgences were hidden behind iron discipline. He was not known to drink. He kept his meals simple. He preferred solitude to banquets. But within the stone heart of Sintra's royal palace, a separate world was fashioned, a cloister of desire constructed like a monastery, silent and sacred. There he created a Capella dos Silencios, the Chapel of Silences. Its name did not come from prayer. No priest ever offered mass there. Instead, it was João's private sanctum, a place where confession took a different form, where acts replaced words, and silence was not holiness, but submission. The entrance to the chapel was a narrow passage beneath the royal archive, shielded by a false wall lined with religious scrolls. The path descended steeply into a space carved into the living rock. The temperature dropped, and the flicker of oil lamps cast trembling light across mosaics too disturbing for open display. Saints in states of ecstasy, angels entwined with serpents, martyrs with parted lips and half-lowered eyes. João believed deeply in hierarchy, in the natural order of dominion. He once wrote in a secret letter discovered centuries later in a sealed chest, "The soul must bend to the king as the body bends to God, but who bends to the king's soul? That too must be arranged." In the Chapel of Silences, that arrangement took form. Participants were not chosen for beauty. They were chosen for their resistance. Daughters of nobles who had questioned the crown, scribes who had miswritten royal decrees, monks who had strayed from the approved sermons. They were summoned under the guise of correction, invited into the chapel to face the king, not in judgment, but in ritual. The process was always the same. A white robe, a kneeling bench, a bowl of warmed by scented water. The ritual began with the washing of the feet by João himself, slowly, methodically, in complete silence. It was said that the act was neither tender nor cruel, but something far more unsettling, reverent. Once the cleansing was complete, the supplicant was blindfolded. They were led to the Círculo da Obediência, a circle etched into the stone floor with inscriptions in Latin and Hebrew. At its center, a low platform draped in black velvet. Here, João tested them. He whispered questions, not of state nor law, but of the heart. Have you ever loved someone more than your God? Would you kneel if I were not king? What pleasure do you most fear? They were forbidden to answer aloud. Their bodies became the response, quivering, still, rigid or soft, and João read them like scripture. But he was not a torturer, not in the conventional sense. Pain, to him, was a dull instrument. He preferred the intimacy of anticipation, the alchemy of control. Some said he could keep a hand poised above a shoulder for an hour, never touching, yet unraveling a person completely. Once he kept a foreign envoy locked in the chapel for 3 nights, feeding him only milk and rose water, surrounding him with scent and silence. When the envoy emerged, he abandoned politics entirely and joined a hermitage in Galicia. There were darker whispers, too, of children born from these rites, of women sent to convents under new names, of noble houses whose lineage bore traces of the king's mouth, his breath, his will. His queen, Leonora Vichot, was aware. Perhaps more than anyone, she maintained her role with elegance and distance. She was beloved for her charity, her wisdom, and her cool smile. But she never entered the chapel, never asked questions. It was said she lit a candle outside its concealed wall every Saturday evening, then left without a word. Even as João orchestrated Portugal's expansion along the African coast, even as he forged treaties, eliminated rivals, and built a legacy of administrative brilliance, the Chapel of Silences remained his truest kingdom. He kept a book, bound in dark green leather, no title on the spine. Inside, pressed between the pages, were tokens from his participants, strands of hair, torn silk, dried petals kissed with perfume, each accompanied by a single line written in Joan's careful, restrained hand. She did not cry. He asked for more. This was the first time I doubted God. The final entry came in 1495, weeks before his death. It read only, "I now understand the quiet between prayers. When João died, Portugal mourned the perfect prince, a ruler of unmatched discipline, feared abroad and respected at home. But beneath the marble tomb and the golden epitaph, there still lies the silence he worshipped, the space where touch was scripture, where the soul bent like a reed, and where even a king could confess with his hands. The air in Milan was always heavy in summer, perfumed with crushed lavender, laced with smoke from braziers, and sweetened by the slow rot of fallen figs. But in the year 1476, the heat took on a strange kind of stillness, the kind that hangs when something unnatural moves beneath the surface of power. At the heart of this stillness stood a man draped in silk and steel, Galeazzo Maria Sforza, Duke of Milan. His name, etched into the stone of palaces and cathedrals, was spoken by nobles with feigned loyalty and by servants with shuddered breath. He was tall, elegant, and adorned like an altar, gold rings on every finger, velvet robes lined with fur even in heat, and a dagger always within reach. Not for protection, but for ritual. He was not a king by divine right, but by calculated inheritance, born into a family that had clawed its way up from mercenary command into princely power. Galeazzo understood that fear was more enduring than affection. But unlike rulers who wielded terror as necessity, he wielded it as art. His court was the most opulent in Italy, outshining even that of Florence in pageantry. He commissioned endless processions, fountains that flowed with wine, musicians who played madrigals so delicate they made grown men weep. But beneath the music, beneath the perfume and pageantry, there pulsed something darker. The Duke had a taste not just for control, but for humiliation. He kept a room hidden within the Castello Sforzesco, accessed through a panel in his private chapel. This space, known to only a few, was called La Sala dei Sospiri, the Room of Sighs. It was circular, windowless, with walls lined in damask embroidered not with saints or flora, but with faint golden patterns resembling chains, mouths, open hands. At the center stood a chaise of crimson leather, wide enough for two, yet always occupied by one. Every evening, Galeazzo would select someone from court, sometimes a noble, sometimes a page, sometimes a singer whose voice had lingered too long in the air. They were summoned not with force, but with flattery, an invitation to dine in private, a compliment whispered during vespers, a single glance across the hall. Once brought to the Room of Sighs, they were instructed to disrobe and kneel, not with cruelty, but with ceremony. The Duke, always immaculately dressed, would then begin his ritual, not of seduction, but of deconstruction. He asked questions. Do you believe yourself good? What lie do you tell in silence? How would you beg if I never gave? And with each answer or refusal, he would remove one of his rings and place it in a silver bowl. Once all 10 rings were removed, the guest was expected to weep. If they could not, the ritual was repeated the next night. Some begged to return, others vanished entirely. He kept a record of these encounters, not in books, but in scent. Each guest was assigned a specific perfume, distilled by his apothecaries and stored in hand-blown glass vials. The vials were arranged by year, by tone, by the depth of brokenness. He would open them at random, inhale and say a name, sometimes aloud, sometimes under his breath. His wife, Bona of Savoy, was a quiet woman of noble lineage and colder temperament. She knew of his tastes, but rarely acknowledged them. She bore his children, dined with him when required, and spent most of her hours with priests and tapestries. It was rumored that she once tried to enter the Room of Sighs, that when she touched the panel, she was found hours later kneeling at the door, murmuring prayers in a voice not her own. Galeazzo did not allow women to enter the chamber after that, not because he feared them, but because he believed they saw too much. Beyond the walls of his hidden sanctum, his appetites infected the palace itself. Pages were trained not in diplomacy, but in silence. Servants were instructed to remain barefoot, their steps muffled. No door was ever locked, but every handle bore a ribbon of a specific color, green for entry, blue for delay, black for denial. One painter, summoned from Siena, was tasked with creating a fresco for the Duke's private bathing chamber. He spent months on the piece, an intricate depiction of the myth of Narcissus, except the face in the water's reflection was not his own, but a collage of others, shifting and weeping. When it was finished, the painter disappeared. The fresco remains. The church whispered, of course. But Galeazzo gave generously, endowments to monasteries, indulgences purchased in bulk, donations to relics. And so the whispering never became accusation. Still, his enemies grew. There were merchants whose daughters had been summoned to court and returned with eyes dimmed. Knights whose loyalty cracked under the pressure of what they'd seen behind velvet curtains. Priests who spoke his name without the title. And so, one day in December, as he entered San Stefano for Mass, dressed in purple and gold, he was stabbed to death by 3 men. They claimed to be patriots, liberators, men of virtue, but their hands trembled as they raised their blades. When Galeazzo fell, he did not cry out. He laughed, once sharply, then collapsed onto the marble floor, blood soaking his embroidered shoes. In the room of sighs, the candles burned themselves out that night. The rings remained in their bowl. The perfumes, untouched, slowly faded into the stone. But sometimes, when the palace is silent and the air grows too still, caretakers say the scent returns, unexpectedly, like a breath on the neck, a mingling of sandalwood, citrus, and tears. The signature of a man who mastered not just power, but the architecture of human weakness, and who, in that mastery, built a kingdom no blade could truly destroy. The scent of incense and melting beeswax hovered permanently over the towers of Krakow's Wawel Castle, where banners snapped in the wind like the sudden breath of some slumbering giant. The year was 1530, and Poland's royal court glittered like a cut gem, a strange, fragile jewel balanced between east and west, Catholic solemnity and pagan echo. At its heart sat a boy king who grew into one of the most contradictory rulers of the age, Sigismund II Augustus, the last of the Jagiellon line. To the world, he was a scholar, a refined aesthete, a man of vision who would later unify Poland and Lithuania into one of Europe's largest and most progressive states. But in his youth, those years before governance had fully taken him, he was something else entirely, a creature of fascination. He was beautiful, even by the exacting standards of Renaissance courts. His features were delicate and almost androgynous, his skin pale as candle wax, and his voice carried a strange musical lilt that blurred command and seduction. Courtiers, ambassadors, and even foreign queens commented on his presence, hypnotic, otherworldly, like something painted onto silk by hands too ancient to name. But what they didn't know was what happened behind the doors of the Shimna Vieja, the Dark Tower. Unlike its name, the tower was not a dungeon, nor a place of screams. It stood apart from the rest of the palace, connected only by a covered bridge with windows of green-tinted glass. Its walls were lined with carved cedar, polished until they glowed like amber under torchlight. Inside, the air was still, thick, perfumed with saffron and crushed rose petals. It was here that Sigismund created what he called the Circle of the Veiled Star. No court document ever recorded its existence. No ledger ever listed the names of its participants. And yet, it was real. Entry was invitation only, and once given, the recipient had to follow a very specific ritual. 3 nights of isolation. No mirrors, no speaking, fasting by day, milk and figs by night. Only then could they cross the bridge into the tower, barefoot, blindfolded, led by a servant cloaked in gray. Inside the tower, the guests were dressed in white linen and adorned with star-shaped pendants. They were asked no questions, only given instructions. Each room within the tower offered a different experience. One was lit with dozens of paper lanterns, each inscribed with a name. The names were whispered by the participants in the dark, and whichever lantern flickered most violently was considered a sign, a direction, a choice. Another room was filled with music played by unseen hands. The melody was always the same, slow, mournful, seductive in its rise and fall. The participants were told to move through the room as if dreaming, touching only when compelled by the rhythm. But the deepest chamber, the Komnata Sishi, the chamber of stillness, was where Sigismund waited, alone. He never spoke there, never issued commands. He simply watched, reclined on a divan of blue silk, surrounded by drapes that moved even when the air was still. His eyes followed every motion, and when he chose, he would raise a single finger. That was the signal. The chosen guest would then approach, kneel, and lay their head against his lap, not in submission, but in offering. Sigismund would run his fingers through their hair, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. There were never more than 12 members in the circle at any one time, and yet, its influence reached every corner of the kingdom. Ambassadors who once scoffed at the boy king found themselves returning again and again, claiming diplomatic purpose. Artists painted him with symbols no one could explain. Moons reflected in wine goblets, stars bleeding into roses, veils fluttering over unseen mouths. One Italian cardinal, after spending 3 days in the tower, returned to Rome and burned his personal library. He never said why. Sigismund's own court grew uneasy. Whispers began to creep into the corridors about disappearances, about strange symbols carved into the tower stone during full moons. About the night a thunderstorm struck the castle and lightning illuminated the bridge, showing the silhouette of a figure floating inches above the stone floor, arms outstretched like wings. The king's official consort, Elizabeth of Austria, refused to sleep in the castle. She claimed the air around Sigismund hummed with the voices of those who had not yet been born. Their marriage was never consummated. But there was one name spoken more often than any other in the circle's unseen ranks: Barbara. Barbara Radziwiłł, Lithuanian noblewoman, enchanter in velvet, and the only woman Sigismund ever seemed to truly desire. She entered the tower not as a supplicant, but as an equal. They would sit across from each other in silence for hours. No ceremony, no veils. She was said to match his stillness with her own. When she eventually became queen, the court erupted in scandal. Nobles rebelled, bishops protested, but Sigismund would not bend. He wept at her feet in front of his council. He threatened to burn the crown itself before forsaking her. And when Barbara died, suddenly, mysteriously, barely 2 years into their marriage, the tower was sealed. The bridge barred. The circle disbanded. Sigismund was never the same. He ruled with clarity, precision, and increasing melancholy. His gaze no longer lingered. His hands no longer touched. But some claimed that on moonless nights he would slip away to the bridge, dressed in white, and stand there for hours, waiting, not for courtiers, not for lovers, but for a voice he could no longer hear. The voice that once answered his silence with a silence of her own, a mirror that did not reflect but consumed, the final star of a circle that never truly ended. In the barren splendor of Andalusia, where the orange blossoms clashed with dust and the sun itself seemed carved in gold, the Alcazar of Seville loomed like a memory, its arches repeating into infinity, its tiles cool under bare feet. In this palace of contradictions, where Christian kings ruled from Moorish marble, there emerged a monarch whose desires were as layered as the very stones beneath his throne. Don Carlos, Prince of Asturias, heir to the Spanish crown in the mid-16th century, never wore the crown. He never led armies. He never signed decrees. But his story would stain the silk of royal history like spilled red wine, vivid, fragrant, and impossible to erase. He was the son of Philip II of Spain, the most Catholic of kings, whose devotion to order was as absolute as his dominion over flesh. But Don Carlos was not born for order. He was born for ruin. From the start, he was marked. His birth was difficult, his body frail, his spine slightly twisted, his gait uneven. His tutors noted a strange gleam in his eye. Intelligent, yes, but unstable, like the glint of a knife on the edge of a feast. He could quote Aristotle by 14, but tortured birds behind the garden walls. He would spend days lost in books of martyrdom and erotic poetry, sometimes reading both aloud in the same breath, his voice low and almost reverent. By 17, he had developed what the court called curiosidades secretas, secret curiosities. These curiosities revolved around pain, not inflicting it, not initially, but observing it. He would pay servants to slap each other, to wrestle in silence, to weep in front of him without explanation. He claimed he was studying emotion. He said suffering was the truest mirror of the divine. Soon it was no longer enough to watch. He began to invite young pages into his chambers under the pretense of tutoring. Once the door closed, the lessons became less academic. He asked them questions, always questions. What does your skin remember? Have you ever seen your father cry? If I touched your throat, would you sing or scream? The boys who answered well were rewarded with rings, rare wines, whispered praise. Those who resisted were dismissed and replaced by others more pliable. Don Carlos developed elaborate rituals. He would bathe only in the dark. He forbade his attendants from speaking in his presence unless asked a question. He wore gloves even in summer, but removed them only when stroking the skin of another. His rooms were filled with objects, not relics of saints, but artifacts of the body. Locks of hair, used cloths folded like letters, vials of sweat and perfume sealed with wax. He kept a drawer of feathers for blindfolding, a drawer of dulled blades for tracing flesh without breaking it, a drawer of rosaries made of human teeth. There was a nun, Sister Beatrice, who once came to his chamber at the king's request to counsel him toward holiness. She left 2 hours later with her habit torn, her crucifix turned backward, and a single phrase written in blood on her palm: "Only in darkness do I see." The king was furious, but also afraid. For Philip II, faith and order were synonymous, and Don Carlos threatened both. He was a fracture in the cathedral walls, a storm gathering above the altar. Attempts were made to control him. He was locked in his rooms. His servants were rotated, interrogated. But Carlos had charm, and more dangerously, he had need. He seduced the daughters of courtiers and then made them confess their sins before mock altars he built himself. He made a young tutor dance in chains, promising release if he cried beautifully. He kissed a bishop's ring, then bit his hand so hard it left scars shaped like wings. In 1568, something broke completely. Carlos attempted to flee Spain. He claimed he was going to Flanders to join the war, but letters found later suggest something else, that he was planning to build a new kingdom, a place where pain is language and crowns are worn on the skin. He was captured before he could leave. The king, his own father, declared him mad. He was confined to a single chamber in the Alcazar. It had no windows, no mirrors, only candlelight and stone and silence. What happened in that room over the next 6 months was never officially recorded, but fragments remain. A servant claimed he saw Carlos pressing hot wax to his chest and singing hymns backward. A guard reported hearing laughter one night, followed by sobbing, then silence. A visiting priest found pages of parchment scrawled with questions, hundreds of them, none answered. Where does love go when no one speaks it? Is God watching if the lights are off? How many tears fill a chalice? In July of that year, Don Carlos died. The cause was never confirmed. Some said starvation, others poison. A few believed he simply willed himself into disappearance. The body was buried quickly, the name silenced, the chamber sealed. But for years afterward, those who lived in the Alcazar claimed the scent of burning wax lingered in the walls. That certain questions would appear on the edges of tapestries, stitched in thread too pale to notice unless the light hit just right. And sometimes, in the depth of the hottest Andalusian nights, guards heard footsteps pacing behind the sealed doors. Soft, measured, bare, as though someone inside still awaited an answer. The canals of Venice glimmered like veins of black marble beneath the moon, their surfaces dappled with gold from swaying lanterns and the flickering torches of silent gondoliers. At night, the city exhaled. It whispered in the tongue of rustling silks and muffled laughter, in the clink of glass goblets and the creak of doors left ajar just long enough. It was the twilight of the 16th century, and Venice, queen of the Adriatic, was swollen with secrets. Amid its masked balls and mirrored palaces reigned Doge Marino Grimani, a ruler cloaked not only in velvet and ceremonial crimson, but in intrigue, indulgence, and a thirst that had nothing to do with wine. Grimani was not born into power. He climbed to it, one carefully placed foot at a time, through marriage, through bribery, through theater. He understood the mask before he ever wore one. By the time he reached the Dogeship in 1595, he had mastered the art of appearing devout while harboring a heart soaked in shadow. His palace, Ca Grimani, became a place of paradox. The upper halls were filled with relics and portraits of saints, but beneath them ran a network of hidden salons and salons within salons, spaces known only by whispered names among the elite. The most infamous of these was called La Stanza delle Carezze, the room of caresses. It could not be found by accident. One had to be invited, not with words, but with a gift. A single black carnation delivered in the night, tied with silver thread. Those who received one were summoned on the next full moon and brought to the palazzo by boat, blindfolded and silent. The entrance was beneath the marble floor of a music room, revealed when the right notes were played in the correct sequence on a lute suspended above the fireplace. Inside, the chamber resembled nothing so much as an opera set designed by madness. The walls were lined with velvet, but stitched into the fabric were tiny silver bells, so small they couldn't be seen, only heard when someone moved. There were no windows, only mirrors that never reflected directly. The air was thick with a perfume brewed from ambergris, wine, and crushed jasmine petals. The rituals within the room were neither orgies nor ceremonies. They existed in the tense, aching space between. Each participant was dressed by attendants in elaborate costumes that obscured identity. A winged satyr, a shrouded sibyl, a blindfolded saint. No one was allowed to speak unless prompted, and Grimani always masked himself, often as an archangel with black feathered wings, observed from a throne set high in a carved alcove above the room. From there he gave instructions. Touch without holding. Speak your mother's name into a stranger's ear. Kiss only shadows tonight. Each command was delivered in a voice barely above a whisper, but carried with such precise diction that it echoed like prophecy. Grimani believed that identity diluted desire, that true pleasure could only exist when stripped of context, of familiarity, of self. The participants were not people. They were echoes, archetypes, archaeological dust reassembled into form for a single night. But it was not merely pleasure he sought. He required fear. One night, he ordered that the room be lit by only a single candle. He asked every guest to kneel, blindfolded, and confess aloud the thing they most wished had never happened. As each confession fell into the dark, the candle was brought closer, until the shadows danced against their skin like claws. A woman wept when she spoke of the child she'd abandoned. A man trembled as he described the way his father died and how he had smiled. Grimani clapped once. The candle was extinguished, and in the silence that followed, someone began to sing, a lullaby in a language no one could identify. He kept a book, not of names but of moments, recorded not chronologically, but sensually. Each page described a night in the chamber through scent, sound, and texture. Cinnamon, the softness of inner thigh, the gasp before forgiveness. Copper, the rustle of a broken wing, the laughter that sounded like mourning. His wife, Morosini, a noblewoman of grace and formidable intelligence, lived above these secrets, or perhaps beside them. She hosted poets, maintained a reputation of virtue, and turned a blind eye to the midnight visitors arriving at the back of the palazzo in unmarked gondolas. It was said she once entered the room of caresses, not as the Doge's consort, but as a participant. Grimani did not recognize her until she spoke his name in a moment of passion. He did not punish her. He had the entire room replastered the next day. But the obsession grew. Grimani became more withdrawn from politics, more erratic in council. He claimed he could see people's hidden selves in their gestures, that he knew the flavor of a man's regret by the way he blinked. One evening, during a state banquet, he rose to make a toast and instead recited a confession. I once watched a man die while dressed as my reflection, and I felt more alive than in any moment before or since. He collapsed shortly after. His health declined rapidly. Some said he was poisoned. Others said he had seen too much of something not meant to be seen. On the night of his death, the bells sewn into the velvet of the secret chamber rang without movement. The servants who entered to clean found no guests, only a single black carnation placed on the throne, and beneath it, a smear of red wax in the shape of a closed eye. La Stanza delle Carezze was sealed the next morning. But the palace, now a museum, holds echoes. Visitors report hearing soft music when alone in certain corridors, and sometimes, during renovations, black carnations are found growing between cracks in the marble. No roots, no soil, just the delicate, impossible bloom of a secret that never quite died. In the gray-green stillness of the Scottish Highlands, where fog hangs like ancient breath and the hills roll like sleeping beasts, there once stood a fortress so remote it seemed carved from the memory of war itself. Inverness Castle, built of red sandstone and stiff with centuries, was never just a fortress of stone. In the early 17th century, it became a fortress of the mind, sealed, echoing, and filled with strange rituals whispered behind its weather-worn walls. It was here that James VI of Scotland, who would later become James I of England, spent his formative years, molded not by the grace of majesty, but by suspicion, superstition, and solitude. James was a scholar, a theologian, a philosopher king in the making. But beneath the refined surface of his education was a nervous boy haunted by shadows not entirely his own. He had grown up without his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, who had been exiled and executed far from his grasp. He was raised by stern tutors, hardened regents, and the long echo of betrayal. His body was frail, his speech awkward, his legs prone to trembling. He learned early that fear was more loyal than affection, and it was fear that would shape his deepest desires. From an early age, James was fascinated with the invisible. He devoured books on angels, demons, omens, and spirits. He believed not only in witches, but in their power to wound kings through whispers and weather. He would go on to write Demonology, a full treatise on the dark arts and their infiltration of human affairs. But before the book, before the trials, before the flames, there was the Chamber of Listening. This room, hidden deep in Inverness, below the North Tower, was not found on any architectural plan. It was said to have been constructed during a renovation commissioned by James himself under the guise of creating a wine cellar. The chamber was round, windowless, and lined entirely in wood darkened by smoke and age. Along the walls were dozens of tiny funnels, sound tubes, handcrafted, concealed behind carved motifs of ears, mouths, and serpents. The tubes connected to corridors and rooms throughout the castle, making it possible to hear conversations from above, distorted but unpickable. James spent countless hours in this room, listening. He called it his theater of truth, and truth, to him, was not spoken in declarations or decrees, but in whispers, in gasps, in the things people said when they thought themselves alone. But that was only the beginning. He began to invite guests to the chamber, always alone, always at night. He offered them a seat, poured them wine, and asked them to speak. Not to him, but to the room. Say what you cannot say elsewhere, he would murmur, and they did. Confessions of lust, betrayal, guilt, envy. The echoes bounced off the wood like breath on a mirror, lingering long after their words had faded. James recorded everything. He kept journals, thin books with black leather covers, each labeled not by name but by scent. He used perfume oils to mark them, cinnamon for those who lied well, rose for the broken-hearted, myrrh for those who held secrets like knives. But over time, he grew bolder. He began to conduct experiments. He would place two guests in separate rooms, connected only by the sound funnels. He would instruct one to speak their fears aloud. The other, unknowingly, would hear the words. James believed this would create a psychic bridge, an emotional infection, a way to bypass the soul's defenses. One courtier, a young man named Thomas Elphinstone, was subjected to this experiment for 7 nights. On the 8th, he was found standing in the castle courtyard, barefoot in the snow, whispering James's name again and again, eyes vacant, palms bleeding from self-inflicted cuts shaped like ears. James called it resonant purification. He began sleeping in the chamber. He said it was the only place he could hear himself think. Servants brought him meals, but rarely spoke. He would stare into the walls, murmuring phrases from scripture mixed with fragments of childhood lullabies. And then there were the dolls. No one knew where they came from. They began to appear in the chamber, hand-stitched figures made of wool and bone, dressed in fragments of real clothing taken from the guests who had confessed there. Each doll was placed in its own niche. James called them echoes. He spoke to them in the morning. He sang to them at dusk. One visitor, an English nobleman, was invited into the chamber and later wrote in his diary, "The king regards those dolls as one might regard saints, or lovers, or both." When James became King of England in 1603, the chamber was sealed, but its memory traveled with him. At Whitehall Palace, he commissioned a new room, hexagonal this time, lined with mirrors that distorted sound. He kept only 3 of the dolls. The others, he said, belonged to Scotland and must remain in the north. And though his court in London saw the polished version of James, the scholar, the poet, the monarch, they did not see the man who walked the palace at night with a bundle of tiny clothes pressed to his chest, listening to walls that no longer whispered. He ruled for over 2 decades in England. He united crowns. He sired heirs. He passed laws, but he never stopped listening, never stopped seeking that echo, that gasp of truth, that pure, unguarded noise that proved the soul could still be touched. If not by love, then by something darker, deeper, and far more permanent. The white stones of Cairo's citadel glowed under the heavy moon like bones picked clean by centuries. The desert night was warm and slow, the kind that wrapped itself around the breath and dulled the senses. But behind the lattice windows and arched doorways of the Muhammad Ali Palace in the late 18th century, there lived a man whose desires ran colder than the Nile and far deeper than its silted bed. Muhammad Ali Pasha, often called the founder of modern Egypt, was in many ways a creature of ambition. An Albanian by birth, a soldier by trade, he had risen to power through cunning, ruthlessness, and an instinct for survival so acute that even the Ottomans, who appointed him governor, eventually feared him. But it is not his empire building that concerns us now. It is his mirror room, Beit al-Maraya, the House of Mirrors. Built in secret and funded through a private treasury, this hidden wing of the palace was located beneath the private hammam, a place meant only for purification and quiet, but which served here as a veil to something else entirely. The mirror room was a long hall shaped like the inside of a crescent moon. Every inch of its curved walls was covered in polished glass. Not smooth panels, but shards, thousands of mirrored fragments cut and arranged into waves, eyes, palms, and teeth. No single reflection could be seen without distortion. Faces split, mouths doubled, eyes fractured into kaleidoscopic terror. At the center of the room stood a divan draped in white silk. Beside it, a tall brass censer burned continuously with a slow plume of myrtle and powdered rose resin. The air inside always trembled slightly, as if memory itself had weight there. Muhammad Ali did not use this room often. Only on nights when the stars aligned in a specific configuration, mapped meticulously by his court astrologer, a mute man who never spoke a word but communicated with red ink and broken starlight diagrams. Those nights, chosen individuals were summoned. Not prisoners, not slaves, but scholars, poets, men and women known for their intellect, their clarity, their defiance of superstition. He would welcome them alone, dressed not in robes of authority but in plain linen. He wore no jewelry, no weapons, only a ring of jet stone on his smallest finger. Each guest was instructed to sit on the divan, to look into the mirrors, to speak. What they were to speak was never specified. Some offered poems, some told their secrets, others recited scripture or screamed until their voices broke. But whatever they said, Muhammad Ali listened, and then he asked a single question. "Do you still know who you are?" He asked it softly, gently, as if he feared the answer. Because by then, most could no longer recognize themselves in the shifting, shattering reflections. It was said that one French cartographer, after an hour in the room, went blind, not physically, but spiritually. He covered all mirrors in his house upon returning to Europe and was later found dead, surrounded by crumpled maps with no names written on them. Another, a Persian calligrapher, began writing backward and refused to speak in any language but an invented tongue made of sighs and humming. But Muhammad Ali was not seeking madness. He was studying it. He believed that the soul was not fixed, that it could be stretched, broken, bent into new forms. And the mirror room was his crucible. There were whispers of what else took place there, that he sometimes brought young soldiers from his personal guard into the room after battle, that he made them remove their tunics, stand in silence, and watch their own fear tremble across the 1,000 shards, that he touched their shoulders lightly, as if conducting a prayer, that he whispered to them not words of comfort, but of recognition. You are not the one who left your mother's house. You are the one who was born again here. Even more unsettling were the reports of what lay beyond the mirror room, a narrow corridor that led to a smaller chamber, entirely empty save for a basin of ink and a table on which sat a single object, an ivory mask. It had no eye holes, no mouth, only the faint suggestion of features. Those brought there were instructed to don the mask and sit in silence for an hour. When they removed it, they were told they had no past. They were given a new name, a new garment, a new task. Many became elite members of Muhammad Ali's personal retinue, men and women who obeyed without question, who seemed to anticipate his needs, who never once glanced at their own reflections again. They were called the silver-eyed, for their eyes always seemed to reflect candlelight even in the dark. Muhammad Ali kept a ledger of these initiates. He did not number them, but instead gave each a symbol: a knife in a garden, a child without a face, a lion eating honey. These symbols appeared later in dispatches and royal orders, encoded in correspondence no one else could read. And when he died in 1849, the House of Mirrors was sealed by his successor. The doors were plastered, the corridor collapsed. But workmen swore that before the final stone was laid, they heard laughter, soft and echoing, not from behind them, but from within the walls themselves. Not laughter of joy, not of madness, but the quiet, knowing laughter of someone who, in being broken, had finally become whole. Beneath the ever-clouded skies of St. Petersburg, where frost bit the breath from even the wealthiest mouths, and the Neva River moved like a serpent beneath its own weight, stood the Winter Palace, a monument to imperial grandeur and frozen secrets. Its halls echoed with the clack of polished boots and the hush of fur-lined whispers. But during the final decades of the 18th century, behind the double doors of its most private wing reigned a sovereign whose hungers reshaped not only a nation, but the boundaries of desire itself. Catherine II, Catherine the Great, was more than an empress. She was an architect of illusions. History remembers her for wars, reforms, and letters to Enlightenment thinkers. But those who served her more intimately knew there were two Catherines, the ruler of ink and marble and the goddess of silk and silence. It was the second Catherine who resided in the Zerkalnaya Galeria, the Mirror Gallery. This gallery, sealed to all but a handful of hand-picked servants, was hidden behind the imperial bedchamber. From the outside appeared to be a small antechamber, used perhaps for storage. But once within, its dimensions shifted. An elongated octagonal room lit entirely by hanging lanterns of Venetian glass, their flames protected by curved mirrors that turned each flicker into a constellation. The walls were paneled with antique mirrors salvaged from palaces across Europe. Some were cracked, others fogged with age. None gave a clear reflection. Catherine preferred it that way. She believed that clarity was the enemy of imagination. At the center of the gallery stood a low dais draped in silver cloth. Above it hung a chandelier shaped like an inverted crown, each point tipped with a glass teardrop. Surrounding the dais were 12 seats, never more, never fewer. The Circle of 12. Those who were invited to join the circle were not always nobles. Some were foreign dignitaries. Others were philosophers, musicians, actors, even servants promoted by a single glance. The only requirement was that they surrender their names. Inside the gallery, names held no power. There were only masks and whispers. Each mask was custom-made, crafted in porcelain and lacquered to reflect the stars. Some bore the faces of Greek deities, others the blank calm of death masks. Each one was chosen for the wearer by Catherine herself. She claimed the masks helped people become what they truly were. She always entered last, never late, never first. Dressed in a robe of white fox fur with pearls braided into her silvering hair, she would glide to the dais and sit barefoot, legs crossed, eyes half-lidded in a gaze that made men forget their language. The rules of the Mirror Gallery were known by heart and spoken aloud at the beginning of each gathering. 1. Silence is the beginning. 2. Speak only truth or pleasure. 3. Leave with nothing but memory. The rituals that followed were not orgies. Catherine dismissed such comparisons as crude. Nor were they theatrical. They were meditations, constructed like dances, like where touch replaced speech and stillness held power greater than movement. She called it orchestration of essence. Sometimes she commanded only touch, fingers brushed against silk, hair combed slowly, breaths aligned like music. Other nights, she demanded performances, monologues of desire, confessions of shame, reenactments of dreams. But always, always, there was a mirror, held in hand, placed at the feet, hung above the participants. No one could escape the sight of themselves, refracted back through another's gaze. One particular ritual, known simply as the undressing, became legend even among those who never entered the gallery. In this rite, each participant removed a single layer of clothing, but not by their own hands. Another chosen guest would approach, pause, and ask a question. Only if the question moved the soul, eliciting a physical reaction, a tremble, a sigh, was the answer earned in cloth. It was not about nudity. It was about exposure, the removal of protection. One night, a famed general, stern and unreadable, was asked, "When did you last beg?" His silence lasted an entire minute. Then he whispered, "At my mother's deathbed." The cloth slipped from his shoulder like snow melting on granite. Catherine never interfered. She watched, but she took notes, always. Her journal, bound in white leather and stored within a mirrored drawer in the gallery itself, was filled not with names, but with symbols. She recorded gestures, phrases, scents. She noted when someone's breath caught on the word forgive, or when two strangers' eyes met in a way that suggested a shared history never spoken aloud. She called it her Atlas of Intimacies. It is said that this atlas contained insights she later used in diplomacy, in war, even in marriage negotiations for foreign princes. Not by blackmail, but by knowing, by understanding the depths of what people yearned for and what they feared most. The mirror gallery did not stay secret forever. Foreign agents caught wind of it, and the court grew restless. Rumors swirled, tales of masked lovers, of orgiastic rituals, of the empress consumed by lust. But Catherine never denied it. When asked, she smiled and said, "If they are watching shadows on the wall, let them wonder what cast them." In her later years, she ceased visiting the gallery. She said it had fulfilled its purpose. But she left the lanterns burning. She ordered that no one enter unless summoned, that the masks remain on their shelves, that the dice never be cleaned. After her death, the gallery was sealed. But during the Russian Revolution, when the palace was looted and its treasures carted away or shattered, the mirror gallery was untouched. No looters entered, no mirrors broken, no lanterns stolen. Perhaps it was the silence that repelled them, or the sight of their own reflections, distorted, multiplied, full of questions. Reflections that asked, as Catherine once did, "Who are you when no one is watching?" And more frightening still, who do you become when they are? The Bavarian Alps, blanketed in perpetual mist and cloaked with towering pines, always seemed to cradle something otherworldly, half dream, half warning. And nestled among their frozen ridges was a palace so ornate, so surreal, it seemed to have been summoned from a fevered lullaby rather than built stone by stone. Neuschwanstein Castle. It was here, in the final quarter of the 19th century, that King Ludwig II of Bavaria, the Swan King, the Moon King, the Mad King, wove a world of fantasy so thick it choked reality into silence. He was born into royalty, into the blinding expectation of bloodlines and borders. But Ludwig, even as a child, was always somewhere else. He read German legends until his fingers were ink-stained. He wandered forests barefoot, believing himself kin to fairies. He addressed birds as if they were ministers and built imaginary kingdoms in his mind long before he ever inherited a real one. But it was not madness that defined Ludwig. It was longing. A longing so deep it became the marrow of his being. Longing for beauty so perfect it transcended flesh, for companionship that needed no voice, for a love so tragic it would burn forever without ever being touched. He ascended the throne in 1864, barely 18, and immediately withdrew from public life. Where others held court, Ludwig held silence. Where others waged wars, Ludwig staged operas. And at the heart of his private world was Der Raum des ewigen Spiels, the room of the eternal play. The room was hidden inside Neuschwanstein's upper towers, accessible only by a narrow spiral stair disguised behind a false wall of painted lilies. It was not large, perhaps the size of a chapel, but its every surface was a mosaic of colored glass. Not mirrors, not windows, glass layered like scales, catching candlelight and twisting it into impossible hues. There were no furnishings save for a single bed carved from rosewood, shaped like a swan in flight, its wings arching into a canopy above. On certain nights, Ludwig would ascend alone. Wearing a robe of indigo velvet and a circlet of silver stars, he would light the room with oil lamps whose flames turned blue when kissed with lavender. Music, always Wagner, always soft, played from a concealed phonograph. And then the performance would begin. There were no actors, no audience, only Ludwig and the painted masks. Each mask was mounted on the wall, resting on carved wooden heads, their features modeled after the characters of Germanic tragedy: Parsifal, Lohengrin, Siegfried, Tannhäuser. He had each mask crafted by hand, their eyes set with moonstone, their lips frozen in half sorrow, half ecstasy. Each night, Ludwig chose one. He would speak to it, cradle it, whisper confessions and questions into its silence. Sometimes he kissed it, sometimes he wept. But he never, ever removed his robe. The ritual was strict. He believed that to undress would shatter the illusion, that flesh would collapse what imagination had built. He called the mask Stille Geliebte, silent beloveds. There are journals written in Ludwig's own hand that describe these rituals in lyrical fragments. Tonight I asked Tannhäuser if he remembered the fire. He did not speak, but his silence grew warmer. I touched Lohengrin's brow, and the moonlight changed. I saw the truth then. Beauty must always grieve. It was in that room that Ludwig conceived his greatest architectural visions. Palaces made of ice, floating cathedrals, theaters where the stage spun like a planet. None were ever built, but their blueprints still exist, rolled and forgotten in the royal archives, their corners stained with candle wax and the oil of longing fingers. Outside the castle, Ludwig's ministers grew restless. His eccentricity was tolerated for a time, even admired, but his refusal to govern, to marry, to anchor himself to reality became dangerous. He drained the treasury to build more palaces. Linderhof, Herrenchiemsee, all replicas of dreams, reflections of Versailles or Valhalla, never intended for guests. He banned mirrors from his personal quarters, claiming they diluted memory. He spoke often of other worlds, pale lakes beneath the stars, voices that could only be heard in snow. Servants reported finding him asleep in the garden fountain, his lips blue, a music box clutched to his chest. And through it all, the room of the eternal play remained his sanctuary. One evening, a valet entered unbidden, seeking the king during a storm. He found Ludwig kneeling before the swan bed, speaking softly to Parsifal's mask. He was asking over and over, "If I die in beauty, will I be remembered in silence?" The valet was dismissed, his tongue cut out the next morning. In June of 1886, Ludwig was declared insane and deposed. He was taken to Berg Castle under guard. But 2 days later, he was found dead in Lake Starnberg, alongside the body of the very doctor who had examined him. The cause of death was never proven. When they searched Neuschwanstein afterward, they found the room of the eternal play untouched. The swan bed was neatly made. The lamps still burned. And on the rosewood floor, drawn in powdered violet chalk, was a single phrase in Old High German, "Was ist schöner von ein Sar?" What is beauty, if not a wound? To this day, tourists wander Neuschwanstein, marveling at its towers, its frescoes, its dreamy absurdity. But no one is shown the topmost stairwell, and no one is told about the room of masks, because beauty, as Ludwig knew, is a curse best left behind closed doors, especially when it demands to be loved, but never touched. The summer sun in Delhi scorched without apology. It painted the sandstone of the red fort with heat and shadow, shimmering like smoke above the domes and archways that housed generations of emperors. But beyond the formal gardens and perfumed courtyards of the Mughal court, behind silken screens and echoing corridors, there lived a man whose every gesture was poetry, and whose every appetite curled like incense into the air. Muhammad Shah Ranjila. He reigned from 1719 to 1748, a period that began with promise and ended in decline. To his enemies, he was weak, distracted, decadent. To his admirers, he was the embodiment of refinement, a connoisseur of music, perfume, poetry, and touch. But none denied that his name, Ranjila, meaning the colorful, was well earned. He was not a warrior. He left the burdens of empire to his courtiers, his viziers, and eventually to chance. What he built instead was a court unlike any the Mughal dynasty had known before. A world wrapped in silk and sound, intoxicated with excess, obsessed not with conquest, but with sensation. At the heart of his world stood Dari Rangjin, the Hall of Hues. It was not listed among the official wings of the Red Fort. Hidden within the female quarters and veiled behind an unassuming tapestry of lotus blossoms, it was a private temple to aesthetic indulgence. The walls were lacquered with crushed gemstone pigment, creating a room that shimmered in changing color with the time of day. Topaz in the morning, emerald by noon, and amethyst beneath candlelight. But it was not merely beautiful, it was designed to disarm. No sound echoed. The floors were padded with layers of woven silk. Lanterns were hung low, their light filtered through tinted mica. Music played always, subtle, untraceable melodies from instruments hidden behind carved jolly screens. The air smelled of attar, rose, sandalwood, and the musk of human longing. Only those chosen by the emperor were permitted to enter. and none entered clothed. Every visitor, whether prince, poet, concubine, or soldier, was bathed first, anointed with scented oils, wrapped in gold-threaded gauze, and led barefoot into the chamber where Muhammad Shah waited. He did not wear his crown in Dar Ranjan. He wore only a robe so sheer it whispered when he moved, its color shifting like the room itself. Around his neck, an amulet containing a verse he had written in his own hand. Pleasure is the proof of paradise. In this sanctum, no one addressed him as king. They called him Dilbar, beloved, and in return he gave them a ritual unlike any other. He asked no one to speak. Instead, he touched, gently, slowly, reverently. A palm against the cheek, fingers tracing the line of a collarbone, the soft press of lips on a wrist. He claimed to read the soul through skin, and that every scar, every shiver, every breath revealed more truth than a lifetime of confession. But there were rules. 1, no climax was permitted. 2, no name could be spoken. 3, all encounters must end with a poem. He kept a library of these poems, thousands of them, written in Urdu, Persian, Braj, sometimes in invented languages that blended sighs and syllables. Each one was folded and sealed with wax, never to be opened again. They were stored in a mirrored cabinet locked with a golden clasp, shaped like a blooming rose. Some described the sensation of a single touch stretched across an hour. Others described dreams seen during the rituals, dreams of past lives where emperors and beggars traded places through the whisper of fingers. But not all who entered Dar Ranjan were willing participants. There was the story of the Rajput widow, summoned against her will. She had come to court to plead for her family's land and left with silence burned into her eyes. She never spoke again, but was later seen carving poetry into her skin with shards of glass, her body a canvas of grief and strange devotion. There was the eunuch singer, Asghar, whose voice held the trembling ache of lost innocence. After singing for the emperor in the hall, he vanished for months, only to return draped in white, refusing to speak or be touched. When asked where he had been, he simply placed a finger over his lips and closed his eyes. Muhammad Shah himself believed that ecstasy was a form of divinity, that the body, when stripped of duty and clothed in music, became sacred. He even attempted to consecrate Dar Ranjan as a place of worship, commissioning a minaret of carved sandalwood in its center, topped not with crescent or star, but with a sculpture of an open hand. The clerics refused. Furious, the emperor declared that the divine had no monopoly on beauty, and that if heaven did not want to dwell in longing, it could stay silent. And yet, despite all his splendor, his realm fell into ruin. Persian invaders sacked Delhi. The peacock throne was stolen. The empire bled out slowly, vein by golden vein. But even as cannons echoed beyond the palace walls, the emperor returned to his chamber each night, lighting the lanterns of Dar Ranjan with trembling hands. He died quietly, surrounded by perfumes and verses, a poem clutched in his fist, its wax seal broken, its contents never recorded. After his death, the Hall of Hues was stripped, its silk sold, its floorboards repurposed, but the walls were never painted over. They remained, iridescent, pulsing faintly with color when touched by the sun. And to this day, there are those who claim that if you press your ear to the wall at dawn, you can hear music. Not a song, a sigh, drawn out, delicate and endless, as if the room itself still remembers the man who once made poetry from the shape of a hand in the dark. Beneath the weighty skies of Vienna, where the Danube moved like a ribbon pulled slowly through time, the Hofburg Palace stood regal and immense, its walls a maze of ceremony and silence. In its gilded halls, diplomacy was spoken in waltz steps, and secrets were passed between gloved fingers. But amid the clatter of carriages and the scent of roasted chestnuts in the air, one figure drifted through the empire like a fevered dream. He was not a king, though he held imperial blood. Not a soldier, though his gaze could wound. He was Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria, the only son of Emperor Franz Joseph I and Empress Elizabeth. And he carried within him the strangest inheritance, a soul too large for his title, and a hunger too quiet for salvation. Rudolph was raised in golden rooms, but slept in haunted ones. He was groomed to rule, but taught to kneel. From the age of 6, he was beaten into obedience by his tutors, forbidden softness, denied affection. His mother, the Empress, with her endless hair and melancholy heart, loved him from a distance, while his father saw only frailty and failure in his son. So Rudolph turned inward. He read obsessively, natural history, political theory, erotic poetry. He became fluent in contradiction. By day, he performed his duties, hosting dignitaries, inspecting troops, flattering the court. By night, he disappeared into his own world, a world centered around a place few ever saw. Der Dunkelsalon, the dark salon, tucked behind the Imperial Library and hidden by a false bookshelf that required a specific book, Les Fleurs du Mal, to be tilted backward. The salon was a chamber not of indulgence, but of confrontation. The walls were painted in matte black, and the only light came from glass globes filled with green-tinged oil. The ceiling was mirrored, but warped, bent inward like a womb, making every reflection appear slightly curved, as though all who entered were floating just outside themselves. There was no throne, no bed, only a faintly curved chaise, a writing desk, and an armoire filled with garments stitched from the thinnest fabrics Rudolph could find. Muslin, lace, transparent silk, and hues of pearl and bruised violet. Guests were invited by handwritten notes. No seals, no signatures, only the phrase, "Come see what remains when the world is removed." Each was required to bring an object, not a gift, but a relic, something personal, irreversible. A lock of hair from a lost lover, a broken rosary, a letter never sent. They would arrive, silent, and undress in the salon, their clothes folded neatly, their relic placed on the desk. Rudolph would greet them in a whisper. He wore nothing but a velvet sash and an expression that did not belong to this world. He never touched without being touched first. He claimed that only those who reached into the dark deserved to be answered. And once he was touched, the ritual began. They did not make love. They made stories. He asked them to describe their worst dream, but in the second person. He asked them to imagine dying, then whispered their imagined last words back to them like a lullaby. He tied red threads between their fingers and his, calling it a temporary bloodline. He would place his mouth against their throat, not to bite, but to breathe, to say, "Here, this is where you disappeared." And when the night ended, he wrote them a note, always folded, always perfumed with wormwood, always burned by the guest on departure as instructed. None kept them, but many remembered every word. There were rumors that one woman, a Duchess of Prague, refused to leave, that she remained in the salon for 4 nights straight, neither sleeping nor speaking. When she was finally removed, she was mute and pregnant. No record of a child ever followed. Rudolph once said, "To touch someone is to write on their bones, and I've written so many things I no longer remember the pen I used." But he did remember one name, Baroness Mary Vetsera. She was only 17. But in her eyes, he saw the same wound he carried, a wound shaped like expectation, silence, and unrequited tenderness. They began a private correspondence, written in invisible ink and read only under candlelight in the dark salon. Their final letters, found later, spoke of freedom, not escape, but transcendence. On January 30th, 1889, Rudolph and Mary were found dead together in a hunting lodge at Mayerling. The official story was murder-suicide. The true story was locked away. But when his body was returned to Vienna, the staff who prepared it for burial discovered something strange. His fingers were stained with ash, and between them, clutched so tightly it left an imprint, was a burned scrap of red thread. When they entered the dark salon weeks later, it was empty, the desk cleared, the armoire gone, the mirror above shattered without a sound. But the scent remained, wormwood, rose, and something else, something like the memory of breath on the skin. Not lust, but the deep, secret ache of being seen, if only once, and never again. In the velvet hush of Meiji-era Kyoto, when the world seemed to flicker between lantern light and steam, there lived a man who ruled not with proclamations or armies, but with gestures so precise they seemed written in calligraphy upon the air itself. His name was Emperor Komei, the 121st ruler of Japan, last of the cloistered emperors before the modern age clawed its way through the rice paper walls of the old world. History paints Komei as reclusive, conservative, a man who resisted Western influence with a firm and unyielding hand. But that image, like so many portraits born from distance, omits the pulse beneath the silk. He was not merely traditional. He was obsessed with purity, ritual, and the interplay between discipline and desire. Within the imperial palace, tucked beyond the moss-covered stones and quiet groves of camellias, there stood a tea house known only to a few as Sukihanan, the Hermitage of the Moonflower. It was not marked on any official blueprint. From the outside, it appeared humble, a single-story wooden structure, its roof bent with age, its walls unpainted. But those who entered knew it as a place where the emperor became something more than sovereign, and far less. The interior was stripped of all excess. Tatami mats lined the floor. The walls were hung with pale scrolls bearing brushstrokes so faint they vanished unless viewed by candlelight. And at the far end of the room was a sunken hearth, above which hung a single iron kettle. Steam was always rising. Kome used this space not for tea, but for transformation. He would enter alone at twilight, clothed not in robes of state, but in a simple white kosode, and remain until dawn. No one dared disturb him. Only one attendant, a blind servant named Haku, was permitted to prepare the space beforehand. He would place items according to the emperor's coded instructions: a length of silk, a mirror obscured in soot, a wooden comb carved with Sanskrit, and always a single moonflower placed in a lacquer bowl of ink-black water. Once inside, the emperor enacted a ritual known only to himself. He called it Shinrei no Koan, the riddle of the divine spirit. He would begin by disrobing slowly, folding his garment into precise thirds and placing it beside the flower. Then he would kneel, facing the hearth, and trace characters onto his own skin using the ink from the bowl. The symbols varied. Some were verses from the Manyoshu, others were esoteric glyphs drawn from hidden Shingon scrolls. When his body became text, he began the second phase, recitation. Not aloud, not even mouthed, but breathed. He believed that exhalation carried memory, that if one breathed a word without speaking it, its meaning passed directly to the bones. In this trance, he would perform acts that blurred the line between meditation and indulgence. He would comb his hair with extreme slowness, pausing after each stroke as if seeking an answer in the silence. He would run silk over his thighs, over his chest, then press it to the floor and kneel on it, saying through the action, "This is what I kneel to. This is what kneels to me." And finally, he would place the soot-darkened mirror before him, eyes closed, and open them only once the steam from the kettle had obscured his reflection. He claimed that was the moment the gods might enter. On rare occasions, he invited another to join him. Not lovers, not courtiers, but ascetic monks from distant temples, men who had renounced the world, only to be brought back into it through the emperor's breath. They were asked to kneel opposite him, to mirror his movements, and to surrender a memory in exchange for silence. One monk from Mount Hii later wrote in a secret scroll, "I entered as a man of stillness. I left with my stillness broken and remade. He touched no part of me, and yet I still feel his fingertips beneath my ribs." Kome viewed his body as both altar and offering. He once wrote in a letter, never sent but later discovered folded inside a lacquer box, "The emperor is a shadow made sacred by obedience, but in moonlight all shadows vanish. What remains is the body, and what the body remembers is truth." No one outside the palace knew of Sukihana-an, but within, rumors bloomed. It was said the emperor kept a journal, bound in mulberry paper, in which he documented the spiritual outcomes of each night in the tea house, not in prose, but in diagrams of breath, heat, and timing, a kind of cartography of transcendence. One diagram showed the outline of a man sitting cross-legged, his heart marked with the word Kyoku, memory. Over it, a moonflower petal had been pressed so firmly the veins left prints. Kome's death in 1867 was sudden and veiled in contradiction. Officially, it was cholera. Others whispered of poison. The Meiji Restoration came swiftly after, and with it the world he had held so tightly unraveled. The tea house was sealed. But when the imperial family moved their residence to Tokyo, Sukihana-an was quietly dismantled and packed away. Each beam, each stone, each scrap of scroll. No record exists of where it was stored. Only that, decades later, in a remote temple in Gifu, a monk was found kneeling before a hearth that no longer burned, whispering a name that had not been spoken aloud in generations. He was clutching a comb, and beside him, floating in ink-black water, a single white moonflower. The wind that swept across the Hungarian plain carried with it more than dust and dry grass. It carried the ghosts of cavalry charges, the laughter of forgotten peasants, the heavy breath of nobles wrapped in fur. And in the 16th century, it carried something darker still, through corridors of polished stone, through corridors of the flesh. At the heart of this haunted wind stood a woman, Countess Ershabet Bathory. They called her the Blood Countess, and by the time her story reached the edges of Christendom, it had already grown fangs. To some, she was a monster. To others, a misunderstood victim of political envy. But all agreed, her name should be spoken slowly, like a prayer meant to unsettle rather than comfort. She was born into wealth, lineage, and expectation. Her childhood was filled with Latin tutors, embroidered gowns, and noble ceremonies that tasted of iron and incense. But even then, strange things swirled around her. Servants whispered of fits, of dreams she would speak aloud while asleep, dreams filled with wolves that wore the faces of saints, and rivers that sang in a woman's voice. She married Ferenc Nadasdi, a warrior of notorious cruelty known among the Turks as the Black Knight of Hungary. But Erzsébet was not a wife to be caged. While he waged wars, she ruled their estate, Chakti's castle, with a calm and calculated will. It was here, behind the gates and ivy-covered towers, that she began building what would later be called a Kamaraja Achindeknek, the Chamber of Silences. Unlike the castle's other rooms, this one had no windows, no visible door. It was accessed by descending a narrow spiral staircase hidden behind the fireplace in the western salon, then passing through a second stone door that required 3 keys, each kept in a different part of the estate. It was said she never allowed any other hand to hold all 3. The chamber itself was small, perfectly circular, and constructed with acoustics in mind. Every sound within it, breath, moan, heartbeat, was amplified, echoing softly in return, as if the walls themselves listened and responded. And they did. Because Ersébet did not use the chamber for torture, not at first. It was not a dungeon, it was a stage. There she staged her own morality plays, performed with real bodies. The young peasant girls she brought to the castle were never told why. They were offered food, warmth, coin. Some were even told they would be taught to read, to speak French. But once inside the chamber, names were stripped away. They were given roles: the dove, the sinner, the silent one. And Erzsébet, she played the witness. She sat behind a curtain of red lace, watching. Sometimes she would ask questions. When did you last lie with joy? Would you rather bleed from shame or desire? If you saw your reflection and it spoke first, what would it say? The girls were made to dance slowly, to recite poetry they had never learned, their bodies guided by ropes not of binding, but of suggestion. Erzsébet's attendants, usually mute eunuchs dressed in black, would anoint their skin with oils so cold they tingled, then drape them in silks of yellow and green, the colors of spring and sickness. But the plays always ended the same way, with a single drop of blood, sometimes from a pricked finger, sometimes from a razor-thin cut beneath the ribcage. That drop was collected in a tiny vial made of smoky glass and sealed with wax bearing the Bathory crest. She called these vials sivkunyik, heart tears. She kept them in an alcove above her bed, one for every performance. Dozens upon dozens, labeled not with names but with single words: innocence, tremble, hunger, bloom. The legends say she bathed in blood, that she believed it preserved her youth. But the truth was stranger. Erssébet did not believe in youth. She believed in transformation. She claimed the body could be rewritten. That fear etched new desires onto the skin. That pain, when given context, became something close to prayer. One journal, discovered years after her imprisonment, contained a passage in her own handwriting. Pain without cruelty is confession. Confession without language is ecstasy. I have seen girls become women by bleeding for nothing but beauty. But the empire was shifting. The whispers grew louder. Bodies went missing. Villagers spoke of night chants in foreign tongues, of birds flying in circles over the castle without ever landing. The king, pressed by political enemies of the Bathory family, ordered an investigation. They broke into the chamber. What they found defied simple testimony. Blood, yes, but also poems scrawled on parchment in charcoal and petals. A doll made of wax, pierced with porcupine quills. Vials, ropes, mirrors. An organ, possibly human, preserved in salt. And on the stone wall, in a crimson pigment that had not yet dried, a single sentence: only those who weep for pleasure may call themselves mine. Erzsébet was never tried. She was sentenced to isolation, bricked into a set of rooms within her own castle, the windows sealed, the doors bolted, a single slit for food and breath. They say she sang. For 4 years she murmured lullabies into the stone. Her voice was carried through cracks in the walls, where it lingered in the courtyard like fog. One guard said she laughed each night at the same hour, soft, delicate, as if someone had told a secret worth remembering. She died in 1614, alone. Her body found without a single wound. Her expression was said to be serene. When they dismantled her chamber, years later nothing remained. No vials, no scripts, no stains, only the faint outline of a single footprint on the floor, bare, feminine, and pointing toward the wall, as if stepping not away, but through, into silence, into something deeper than cruelty, into a story only she was ever allowed to finish. The rains of Ayutthaya came heavy in the monsoon season, drumming against golden rooftops and filling the moats with thick red water. Beneath the gilded spires and lacquered eaves of the Siamese court, everything shimmered. Bodies, silk, swords, lies. And within that palace of mirrors and masks, one king moved as if through a dream of his own making. King Narai the Great. He ruled in the 17th century, a time when Siam hovered between worlds, between old animist spirits and new European envoys, between silence and cannon fire, between desire and dread. Narai was a king of visions. He welcomed French Jesuits and Persian merchants, built observatories and walled gardens, and entertained ambitions far beyond his kingdom's borders. But for all his worldly curiosity, he kept one chamber for himself, a chamber no ambassador ever saw, Rongchongwichit, the room of shifting illusions. Located deep within the inner court of Lopburi Palace, his secondary and more secluded residence, it was built in secret by artisans who never left. A single corridor led to it, lined with carved wooden panels depicting mythical scenes from the Ramakien. Demons in chains, monkeys weeping at the foot of a golden throne, lovers touching beneath a blooming naga tree. The chamber itself was windowless, with walls tiled in hundreds of small mirrored tiles arranged not in rows, but in chaotic spirals that reflected nothing clearly. The floor was soft, covered in woven mats dyed with crushed indigo and scattered with golden thread. Above, the ceiling curved like a lotus dome, inlaid with polished obsidian stones that turned candlelight into stars. It was not a place of solitude. It was a place of theater. Each month, when the moon reached its apex, Narai summoned his Chunrak, his circle of beloveds. They were not concubines, nor dancers, nor scholars, but all three, chosen not for beauty or obedience, but for their understanding of roles. Each was given a character: the drowned priest, the feathered orphan, the widow of heaven, the unborn king, the mouth that cannot close. These roles came with gestures, with sense, with scripts that evolved over time. Narai himself never played the same part twice. Sometimes he was a cruel emperor, sometimes a dying saint, sometimes a boy who had forgotten his name. The room held no throne, no audience, only participants. The ritual would begin at dusk. Each person entered through a separate door, guided by a veiled attendant who whispered only a single phrase: "Let go what you carry." Once inside, they were blindfolded. Then the masks were given: papier-mâché, bone, gilded teak, each one sculpted to deny identity. They would sit in a circle and wait, silent, listening to the hum of breath and the shift of silk. Then came the bell, a single hollow chime. The game had begun. In the hours that followed, rules fell away, time stretched. The mirrored walls caught hands and movements and turned them into something mythic. One gesture multiplied into dozens, one moan echoing until it became a kind of choral hymn. Narai watched. Sometimes he played, but always he recorded. In the center of the room sat a low lacquered table, upon which rested his samut tai, a traditional folding manuscript, black mulberry bark inscribed with white ink. Here he chronicled not what happened, but what he believed happened beneath what was seen. The widow of heaven did not speak, but her silence made my pulse vanish. When the unborn king touched my foot, I remembered dying. The mask did not come off, it slid inside. It was said that the king used these rituals to divine the future, not of the realm, but of the self. He believed each person had a constellation inside them, and that ecstasy, when bound to role and repetition, could illuminate it. But the rituals grew stranger. He began to add elements. A caged nightingale released at the final moment, its song cueing the end of play. A bowl of ink into which each participant dropped a hair. A silk ribbon passed between mouths like a silent secret. One night, a French Jesuit named Père Olivier, invited not as priest but as observer, was given a mask and no role. He was told only to listen. He later wrote in his private journal, "What I saw was not debauchery, but resurrection. These people bled memory through motion. The king became no one, and thus became everyone." But not all found the ritual so poetic. One participant, a young Khmer noblewoman, known for her stoicism, removed her mask midway and whispered, "I remember my mother's funeral." She then tore her garment and knelt in the corner for the remainder of the night. No one approached her. When dawn came, she vanished. After that, Nurai added a rule: the mask may be removed only once, and never while speaking. His court began to fracture. Ministers complained of his absences. Foreign alliances frayed. Whispers emerged that he was bewitched, that spirits had replaced his blood with smoke. And yet, the room of shifting illusions remained untouched. When Nurai fell ill, struck down by fever and suspicion, his inner court panicked. General Fatracha staged a coup, executing Nurai's closest confidants, including his foreign advisor, Constantine Falcon. The king was imprisoned within his own palace, denied his rituals, his masks, his roles. But in his final hours, he made a request to be taken to Lopburi, not to rule, not to resist, just one last visit. The request was denied. He died whispering a phrase no one understood, something about the sky being made of hands. Years later, during renovations to the palace, workers uncovered the hidden chamber. Most of it had decayed. The silk rotted, the obsidian cracked, but in the center, the lacquered manuscript remained, still folded, still fragrant with sandalwood. And on the final page, a drawing, not of a king, nor a lover, nor a role, just a circle of masks. And in the center, nothing. The space where the truth had once performed itself into oblivion. The heat of Morocco in midsummer did not simply rest upon the earth, it possessed it. The courtyards of the Bahia Palace in Marrakesh steamed gently at dusk, the scent of crushed mint and orange blossom curling through the air like the smoke of forgotten incense. Beneath painted cedar ceilings and behind zealot-tiled walls, desire flickered in the shadows, always listening, always waiting. And in the late 19th century, when the world outside was beginning to flirt with telegrams and railways, Morocco was still ruled by the weight of the gaze, the hush of silk, and the power of a single man's pleasure. That man was Sultan Moulay Hassan I. He was a ruler both feared and praised, known for his tireless political maneuvering and ruthless consolidation of power. His caravans stretched across the Atlas Mountains. His spies whispered in Cairo and Tangier. He held the city like a rosary, tight, reverent, and unforgiving. But within the Bahia Palace, he was something else. There he was a collector, not merely of jewels or horses or manuscripts, but of silence, submission, and stories that ended in moans. He commissioned a hidden garden, known only to those invited after midnight. It was built not in the open air, but within the palace walls, concealed beneath a dome whose interior mimicked the night sky, painted deep indigo, studded with pinpricks of gold. They called it Jannat al-Mudnabin, the Garden of the Guilty. Its entrance was disguised as a simple storeroom, locked behind a carved door whose key was said to have been kept in the Sultan's turban, wrapped in linen and rose petals. The garden was not lush. It was spare, deliberate. The floor was made of soft sand. The trees were thin and tall, casting long shadows even under the dim lamplight. At the center stood a marble platform carved with geometric patterns too intricate to memorize. Around it, 12 cushions embroidered with script that read not verses from the Quran, but poems of forbidden ecstasy, lines taken from pre-Islamic ghazals, Andalusian riddles, and the Sultan's own hand. Each night he chose one guest, not concubines from the harem, not eunuchs, never twice the same. They were scholars, Sufis, dancers, diplomats. Each was made to undress completely and don a robe the color of sand, nothing beneath, nothing upon the head. Their faces were painted with kohl, not in beauty, but in anonymity. The eyes became portals. The skin became parchment. Before entering, they were given a bowl of sharbat, a sweet syrup infused with crushed damiana, saffron, and ash from a burned fig tree. It slowed the pulse. It heightened touch. It quieted guilt. Once inside, they knelt upon the marble. The Sultan sat behind them. He did not speak. He breathed. And then came the ritual. Al-Fasaha al-Muqaddasa, the sacred eloquence. He whispered questions into the guest's ear, one at a time. What lie did you enjoy most? Where on your body does truth hide? If I placed my hand there, would it still be true? The guest was forbidden to answer aloud. Instead, they had to show him with their body, with movement, with breath. If he believed them, he would reward them. A kiss to the spine, a pressed finger beneath the chin, a pearl placed into the mouth like communion. But if he sensed falsehood, he would rise, circle them, and begin again. The garden was designed for silence. Any sound echoed too sharply turned confession into reverberation. The air felt holy, not because of worship, but because everything unspoken vibrated with tension. No one ever cried out, but many wept. It was said that the Sultan kept a scroll, bound in gazelle hide, upon which he recorded the answers that no one gave. Not in words, but in symbols. One line per night. A line for a shoulder that trembled too soon. A line for a breath held too long. A line for a heart that beat like guilt disguised as pleasure. Over time, this scroll grew to over 12 meters. He called it Risalta, the letter of the hidden. There was one guest, a Jewish physician from Fez, who, upon leaving the garden, renounced medicine and joined a Sufi order in the desert. When asked why, he simply said, "I saw the body ask questions the soul could not answer." Another, a French interpreter from Rabat, vanished the morning after his visit. Decades later, his journal was discovered in a monastery in Corsica. One passage read, "He did not touch me, but I left part of my name in that sand." The Sultan never explained himself. He offered no justification, no apology, no poetry in public. He ruled by decree and silence. But each evening, before the muezzin called the dawn prayer, he would return to the garden, place his hand on the marble platform, and close his eyes. Not in reverence, in remembrance. Of bodies that trembled, of lips that opened without sound, of truths uncovered not by violence, but by presence. When he died in 1894, the Garden of the Guilty was sealed by his successor. But servants who lived long enough to whisper tales to their grandchildren claimed that on certain nights, when the sand was swept from the courtyard, small pearls would reappear, glowing faintly, warm to the touch, as if remembering the mouth that once held them. And in that warmth lived the echo of a ruler who ruled not only through law, but through longing. A king who asked questions that could never be spoken aloud, only felt between breaths, between robes, between shadows that never left the room. In the icy stillness of St. Petersburg's long winter nights, where the Niva River froze like a sleeping serpent, and palace chandeliers cast trembling halos across parquet floors, the Empire of Russia moved with cold, deliberate grace. But within the deepest chambers of the Winter Palace, where even courtiers hesitated to linger too long, one man conducted a private reign far stranger than the one history recalls. He was not Tsar, though he wore the trappings of one. He was Grand Duke Konstantin Pavlovich Romanov, second son of Emperor Paul I, brother to Alexander I, and the man who almost, but never truly, ascended the throne. To diplomats and military men, he was brash, violent, unstable. To his family, he was both loyal and unpredictable. But behind the frost-laced windows and beneath the silent oil portraits, Konstantin built a world made not of politics or duty, but of reversals, rituals, and obsessions carved in silence. This world was centered in a private wing of the Mikhailovsky Castle, once the paranoid refuge of his murdered father, now a monument to contradiction. Konstantin renamed the wing Zerkalny Labyrinth, the Mirror Labyrinth. It was a series of 12 chambers, each one more narrow than the last. The walls were paneled entirely in polished glass, some smoked, some distorted, others faintly tinged in hues of amber and violet. The doors were hidden, the corners rounded, so one could not be sure where reflection ended and passage began. To enter was to dissolve. He used the space not for lovers, but for transformation. Guests were brought there one at a time, always cloaked, always barefoot. They were stripped of clothing and history. They were given a single command upon entry: lose yourself properly. The Grand Duke waited at the center, not on a throne, but upon a low marble platform, surrounded by objects carefully curated. A fencing mask dipped in oil, a child's porcelain shoe, a copy of Ecclesiastes with every page torn except the one reading, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." He did not begin with touch, but with mimicry. He would move slowly, raising a hand, tilting his neck, inhaling sharply, and the guest was expected to mirror him exactly. A dance of mirrored motion, made crueler by the distortions in the glass. One never knew if their reflection was accurate. One never knew which version of themselves the Grand Duke was responding to. At any moment he might stop and say, in a voice so low it cracked the silence, "Who are you when I no longer believe in you?" It was not a question. It was a prompt. The guest would have to answer not with words, but with their body. Each gesture, each trembling muscle, was read like a confession. He believed shame could be extracted through repetition, that the body, when made to reenact desire without fulfillment, would begin to unravel its own fictions. If a guest collapsed, either physically or emotionally, he would shroud them in sable, offer a single sip of chilled vodka from a silver thimble, and whisper, "Now you are ready." Ready for what? None who left ever said. He recorded each session meticulously in a leather-bound volume he called Niga Zabitik, the Book of the Forgotten. It contained no names, only descriptions. She moved as if her soul had borrowed the wrong body. He tried to mirror me, but he only found his father. This one laughed when asked to kneel. I did not stop her. He never revisited guests. Each person entered the labyrinth once. That was enough. There was one exception, a Polish violinist named Leonti, whose left hand had been mangled in a carriage accident, rendering him unable to play. He was summoned not to perform, but to listen. Konstantin placed a single broken violin in the center of the labyrinth, drew Leonti close, and asked him to hum the song he missed most. Leonti began to cry before the first note. The Grand Duke pressed his lips to the back of the man's hand, gently, almost reverently, and said, "Your music is not gone. It lives in your wound." Leonti was never seen again at court. But weeks later, rumors spread that a masked figure had taken residence in the Winter Chapel, where he lit candles every night to no one in particular. Konstantin's obsession with ritual deepened as he aged. He began wearing mirrored buttons sewn into the cuffs of his uniforms. He would speak to portraits in the halls as if they answered. He once forced an entire regiment to parade in reverse for an entire day, claiming he wanted to watch time return to itself. When he died in 1831, suddenly of cholera, his chambers were sealed. The mirror labyrinth was dismantled 2 years later, its panels shattered and melted down for window glass. But before its destruction, one final discovery was made. In the deepest chamber, behind the last hidden door, was a room no larger than a coffin. Inside was a single mirror, completely unblemished, and carved into the floor in Cyrillic script so small it had to be read by candlelight. "When I no longer believe in you, do you still exist?" No one claimed to understand what it meant, but in the decades that followed, palace servants began to speak of strange things, their own reflections moving half a beat too slow, silverware warping when held in candlelight, a voice, barely audible, reciting poetry backward just as they began to fall asleep. They say it always begins with a gesture, a hand raised, a breath held, a question, unspoken, hanging in the glass. "Who are you now that I've made you mine?"